Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
I wish I was in Dixie. Away, away, way down south in Dixie. Bring the niggas with the banjos. Send in the clowns.
Oh, I wish I was in the land of cotton. Oh, signs there are not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. In Dixieland where I was born in early on one frosty morning, look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. Then I wish I was in Dixie. Hooray, hooray. In Dixieland I'll take my stand to live and die.
According to police, Dedman, with 2 teenage girls as his passengers, drove to a local McDonald's, meeting up with the rest of the group. There, according to witnesses interviewed by police, he said, "I ran that nigger over."
He was not remorseful. He was laughing about the killing.
C.O.W.S, Gus T Renegade, and Justice in for another program, hopefully to share constructive information. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I hope this will be a constructive investment of your Thursday evening. Today's date, October 27th, 2011. October 27th, 2011. Again, thanks, everyone, for tuning in. This was a suggestion, I guess, for today's program, suggestion from a longtime listener and investor. He shared information about the book as well as the author's appearance on Book TV. If you check the links on Facebook and I think some of the other spots where I promoted the program, you'll see the link. If you want to get more information, you can check out our guest for tonight's program, his spot on Book TV. More information about the book, I think very constructive, and I think we will hopefully make this relevant for things that are happening right now, 2011, even though we'll be talking about things that happened almost 100 years ago. Our guest for this evening's program, actually his book reminded me of quite a few guests who have been on our program if you've been following for a while. Elliot Jaspin, Buried in the Bitter Waters, The Hidden History of Racial Cleansing in America. He was on the program summer of 2010. Also reminded me of Douglas Blackman, his book Slavery by Another Name. He also was on the program summer of 2010. He did some other works, but those two in particular really reminded me. I think you'll see a connection if you are familiar with those works, if you heard those programs. Our guest for this evening is a staff reporter for the Wall Street Journal and has worked for several news organizations, including the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and the Detroit News. He was awarded the Thomas J. Watson Fellowship for Research in Eritrea and the Sudan. This evening we'll be discussing his 2011 publication, Red Summer, the Summit of 1919 and the Awakening of Black America. Real pleasure to have him on the program joining us live. Our guest, Mr. Cameron McWhirter. Mr. McWhirter, are you with us?
Yes, hi. Thanks for having me on, Gus. I appreciate it.
The pleasure is ours, sir. Thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedule to speak with us this evening. For folks that
I like your bumper music there. It's very bizarre. You know, coming from Atlanta, we don't get to hear that song played that much these days. It's a very strange song as you listen to the lyrics.
Quite a few of our guests have commented on that song and what it meant to them growing up. We've had some guests on who are from your area of the world, Atlanta or the Georgia area, and they have, I can't say fond, but they have profound memories that have lasted with them connected to that song.
Right.
And guests from other areas of the world as well. Yeah, and I think as we'll move through the subject matter, I think it's definitely relevant to your book,
definitely relevant.
And some of the issues. Right on. For folks who might not have read your book, might not be familiar with your work, if you could just give us some background information about the work you do, I think that would be a great start.
Oh, you mean what I do for a living, or the book?
Yes, sir. Just what you do for a living in general.
Well, I work for the Wall Street Journal. I'm a general assignment reporter. I work in the Southern Bureau, so we work in based out of Atlanta. We cover the South, breaking news, politics, business news, from Virginia to the Mississippi, and then from Kentucky down to Florida. So we don't have quite the entire Confederacy, but we have a lot of it, the former Confederacy. And but I've worked before that. I worked in Atlanta, and I was investigative reporter covering politics mostly in Atlanta for the Journal-Constitution. And I've worked in Detroit and Chicago, Cincinnati, New York, all over the place. I'm from Chicago, so I'm a transplant to the South. And I think we can talk about this more later, but one of the things that I think is important, or was what I think is an important element of this book, is there was lots of horrible violence against black people in the South in 1919, but there was lots of horrible violence against black people in the North as well. And certainly after 1919, nobody could kid themselves that it was a, quote, Southern problem.
Absolutely. Hopefully we'll get a chance to cover that as we roll. I definitely want to focus on what happened in Chicago.
Yeah.
This program, I almost began with the poem from Claude McKay, but I didn't want to be redundant. I saw on Book TV that you started off with that poem. I will start, I think, in the spirit of the book. Actually, I'll save it for later. I'll save it for later to get to the chapter dealing with the new Negro. Put a mental note in for myself. This program, the C.O.W.S, acronym context of white supremacy, I have unfortunately concluded that we are in a global system of racism, white supremacy. I use those two terms as synonyms. I have the same definition for both terms. And the definition that I use for both terms, racism and white supremacy, is as follows. A global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white. Do you think that such a system exists, and do you think that's an accurate definition?
I think that I don't think that exists today. I think that in 1919, that was definitely there were the if you don't like what's going on today, you would have hated 1919 because there were thinkers and people, Ivy League educated thinkers writing books, etc. at that time that were incredibly popular among white people, particularly in the United States, but also in Europe, that expounded exactly what you just said, not as a negative thing, as a positive, as white dominance equaled civilization to them. And I understand, and I certainly appreciate people's concerns about existing racism today. I certainly think that there are people who think as you describe. I think it is nowhere near as prevalent as it was then. So, for example, there was a guy named Madison Grant and another guy named Lothrop Stoddard who wrote these books that were, I guess the best way to describe them is sort of pseudo-scientific racism, where they would have maps of the world and where, this is where Nordic races live, this is where, Asian people live, and they would and sort of plot out how white civilization needed to dominate the world because white people were presenting held civilization together. That was sort of a prevalent theory, and those books, these books you can find today on like Ku Klux Klan websites and stuff like that. But in those days, you'd go to your local bookstore, and the places, those kinds of books were selling like hotcakes. And later, of course, as you can imagine, those ideas were expounded by Adolf Hitler and embraced by Hitler. So I think that there is racism today, but I don't think it's anywhere on the scale of what we saw and what was prevalent in 1919. And I guess I'd have to say on the outset, I'm a white person, so that's a whole different. I'm coming at it from a different view inherently, but I'm also not a Pollyanna about things at all, especially after writing this book. And I think that we've made, it may not feel like it, and things wax and wane, but we have made amazing strides compared to then. That doesn't mean we don't have more striding to do.
Okay. Not the first person.
I certainly respect people who
disagree.
have other views, but I just don't see it as a. If you look at the way things were then and what black people, particularly what African Americans had to deal with then compared to today, it's another planet. And I would argue, and if you looked at the book, I would argue that a lot of that change was made by black people black activists who I think are in many ways the heroes of the book.
We will get to that right now. We'll get to that. I'll just make sure, just for our listeners. That you're not the first person to disagree. I would just say that I think the system has certainly refined itself a great deal. 2011 racism, white supremacy in comparison to 1919 racism, white supremacy. Certainly you see a great deal of refinement on many levels, but the bottom line, in my opinion, white people are still in charge and non-white people worldwide are still subjected to and abused by white people. I think that was accurate in 1919. I think it's accurate now, and I think there's a lot of evidence that would support that that's unfortunately still true worldwide. But I could be wrong. Definitely hold that out.
And certainly there's a lot of room to disagree. And there, I guess I would say, like you mentioned, I spent a lot of time in Africa when I was younger, and Africa has lots of problems, but it also has made amazing strides in the post-colonial era, and they have lots of economic problems, but they're overcoming them. And certainly in the United States, the institutional barriers that existed for African Americans in 1919 and afterward, and for many decades afterward, have been removed. Now, lots of other barriers to advancement exist, but if I guess one example I would use is Woodrow Wilson was president of the United States in 1919. He was a Democrat. He was a racist. He when these riots and lynchings erupted across the United States in 1919, he did virtually nothing to stop them, and delayed, even when there was a riot in Washington D.C. and he could hear gunshots right outside of the White House. He did nothing. Eventually he does, but only days after he should have. And if he knew that there was a black man who was also a Democrat in the White House, his head would pop off, So, we've made strides. Having said that, I completely respect that you have, that there are concerns that huge problems remain.
Moving forward to your book, Red Summer, you talk about the riots of 1919 that erupted across this area of the world, the United States, and as you've already stated, not just limited to the South, North-South, massive problem, particularly in the summer, actually I guess I would say late spring and the summer of 1919. You kind of start at the beginning of the book in talking about different variables, different factors that kind of converge to influence what made this such a violent, really spring and summer of terrorism and white supremacy in 1919. Can you talk about some of those factors? I think particularly returning black veterans from World War I, the labor strife with lots of strikes going on.
Yeah, I think one big factor to talk about would be, one thing to put in sort of a more broader context is that the world was really in chaos. So much like today, the world economic system was a mess. There was all kinds of concerns over the rise of the Bolsheviks in Russia. Europe was, these empires that had fought this bloody, pointless war had all collapsed. There was lots of infighting. Anarchists were trying to seize cities. Jewish people were being killed in the Ukraine by various people. The colonial forces were shooting people in India. It was just a mess of a planet. And so everybody was really panicked. And in the United States, there was labor strife like we'd never seen before in this country. There was runaway inflation, which people called high cost of living, HCL. That was everywhere. And everyone was incredibly nervous. Woodrow Wilson told his physician, the world is on fire. And amid all that chaos, there were primarily three things happening for African Americans that were actually really good things in general. But because they occurred in all this mess, they became flashpoints for violence. And one of them was, as you pointed out, African American soldiers had served in World War I in large numbers. Most of them had not seen action. They were in quartermaster units. Of course, the Army at that time was completely segregated. But there were African American units that did serve on the front line, and they did so very bravely. Some of them under the direction and command of French generals. They were treated very, very well by the French people, and because the French people treated all soldiers who were visiting their country well, because they were thrilled that they were coming to fight for democracy and fight for their country. It's important. An important digression here is that I don't mention this in the book, but German soldiers were terrified of African American soldiers and of African French colonial soldiers. They were really scared of them because they were known to be very tough fighters, and this continued on for years. And so even into World War II, German soldiers were terrified of African American soldiers and of colonial forces. But the soldiers fought very bravely. The American soldiers, African American soldiers in Europe fought very bravely. And when they They were awarded medals. They were treated very well. I was in Baltimore, and I was being interviewed by a journalist in Baltimore who had interviewed the last World War I veteran from that area before he passed away. It was maybe 15 years ago. And the man happened to be black, and the soldier. And so this reporter asked him what he remembered most of of his time in the war. And the man told him, I just remember this French farmer feeding me escargot and this really elaborate meal that I got to eat there. So, the French were really treating them well, and this caused a lot of agitation among white American officers, especially from the South, who thought that black people were going to start raising themselves above their station, which is a theme that I will reiterate throughout our talk. And a lot of black soldiers were mistreated by their white counterparts when they were in Europe. So much so that W. Du Bois, who was the editor of the Crisis, went over to investigate in early 1919 and came back and wrote about mistreatment of African American soldiers. And worse, when African American soldiers are over there fighting, and they're told repeatedly, "You're fighting for democracy," and they come back and they're in their uniforms, sometimes with medals on them, and they're on the train going back to their small towns where they'd come from. And as soon as they cross the Mason-Dixon line, they're told to get in the colored car. And when they get home, they're spat upon, or they're sneered at, or they're told to take off their uniforms, or they can't get a job. And I have a letter in the book where an African-American soldier returns to his town in Arkansas, and he's so mistreated that he moves eventually to St. Louis. And he writes that he felt safer in the trenches than he did in Arkansas. And that was a common theme among African-American soldiers and veterans. So that was a point, and that became a point of great tension. Second point would be the Great Migration, which had already begun before World War I, but during World War I it had really taken off because you had this huge demand for labor by Northern industry. They needed workers, and they couldn't get any from Europe because of the war, so they turned south, and there was this large labor pool that would work for relatively cheap pay. And a big factor for the factory owners was African Americans were non-unionized, and they could be used to break strikes, and the unions would not allow, many of the unions were racist and would not allow black members, so it was a perfect foil to weaken union power. African Americans came north and loved it because they had a little more political freedom, they could make a little more money, and they could get away from Jim Crow. Not that there wasn't racism up there, because as soon as they started to come in large numbers, they encountered it. Particularly, for example, Chicago, they were allowed to hold jobs in the stockyards on the south side, but they were only allowed to live in a thin strip of land on the south side, and if they tried to move outside of that area, they would have people throw bombs in their houses or beat them up. So that became a flashpoint. The migration became a major flashpoint in lots and lots of cities. And then thirdly would be sharecroppers in the South. The quintessentially downtrodden class of people in American society who would always go to get their cotton weighed every year and get ripped off by the guy who was weighing it. In 1919, they actually made a lot of money, relatively, because cotton prices were so good that even if they got ripped off, they still made money. And so they were able to start buying land. Some of them bought cars. They bought fancy clothes, and that caused a lot of friction in the South. So all these things were generally pretty good. I mean, it pointed to, anyways, black advancement, either socially or in terms of being accepted as warriors of democracy, or workers in industry, or land-owning farmers. But all this stuff caused tension.
Wow. Definitely important, and you cover that in detail. A lot of these issues, they'll pop back up as we get into the details of some of these specific riots. I wanted to also, the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, plays a key part in the book and in this period. Really, these riots really provides an opportunity for them to grow at an astronomical rate. And I think in the book you kind of focus on three specific individuals, Walter White, James Weldon Johnson, and W.E.B. Du Bois. And I think one of the more important parts of this is that this period kind of saw the leadership in the NAACP switch from being white people to black people, principally the three folks that I just mentioned. Is that an accurate reading of your work?
Yes, and I think, and this goes back to your earlier comment about your views of where we stand today racially, because I think this is where we might diverge, because I think I'm gonna sound like I'm a Pollyanna. I'm gonna sound like I'm waving an American flag, and maybe I am, but I really think, as you can imagine, I'm a white person writing about white violence against black people. So as I started to research this book, an element of what I felt that, like, one of my main emotions in researching this book was going to be atonement, or wanting to some sort of absolution, because I'm exposing this, and there is an element of that, I suppose. But really, the main emotion I started to feel was pride at other Americans who happen to be black, who, in faced with this crisis, fought for the basic tenets of the Constitution of the United States of America. And they weren't, now on a side note, and more aligned with what you were saying, I mean, Marcus Garvey was rising at this time, and I do mention him in the book, and his organization was on the rise. I would put him more in the camp of sort of this racial view of the world. But the NAACP, which grew more and grew ultimately, I think, stronger, or obviously stronger than Marcus Garvey's organization, really wasn't. It really adhered to this idea that black people didn't want a socialist dictatorship, and they didn't want a black empire, and they didn't want to be treated with any special treatment. They wanted basic constitutional principles to be applied to them like they're being applied to anybody else. So they fought back, and I think that's the key theme of the book. Is 1919 was an unprecedented wave of anti-black violence, and its broad goal was simple: to push, whether it was farmers in Jenkins County, Georgia, or black factory workers in Chicago, or anyone else, or any other, or black people living near Howard University in Washington, D.C. It was to push black people as a group back into their perceived station, whatever it had been earlier. Push them down back to where they were. And the overwhelming answer, whether from people fighting literally in the streets, like in Washington and Chicago, or fighting in the courts, like in Arkansas, or fighting politically, like the NAACP, the answer resoundingly was no. You can't push us back into where we were. We're not going to just go quietly back into a submissive state. It's not going to happen. And that doesn't mean that racism didn't stop. It doesn't mean that Jim Crow suddenly gave up. It doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot more violence to come. But the game was on after that, after 1919.
As I said, I was going to start the program. As you said, I think you have a whole chapter about the new Negro and talking about this spirit, which I think covers the most of the book. This change amongst black people in this area of the world, and saying that we're not going to just take this, we're going to fight. I almost started the program with the poem from Claude McKay, "If We Must Die."
Yeah, "If We Must Die" sums it up, because yeah. I mean, he doesn't mention race in the poem. Every black American who saw that poem, and most of them did that summer, knew what it was about. And I could spend 3 hours talking about James Weldon Johnson, but I think he is, he sort of sums up this new attitude, and he really, obviously Du Bois had been with the NAACP for a while, and he had been there from the beginning, and he was the intellectual force of the organization, and he was the the black board member who really pushed the Crisis to become a widely read magazine across the United States. And his essays in 1919 were extraordinary. They were really hitting their mark. I mean, he's a great writer whenever you pick up anything he wrote, but in 1919 he's really hitting his stride. But James Weldon Johnson, who he brought on to the NAACP in 1916, was this really extraordinary person who he had done all these things before. He co-wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing. He spoke fluent Spanish. He'd been a diplomat. He'd been a politician. He's a trained lawyer. He was an incredible journalist, and he had done all this. And he'd written a novel. He'd written poetry. He later on would help push the Harlem Renaissance. He really did all these things, and Du Bois convinces him to put aside his pen for a while because he was really writing a lot, and joined the NAACP as field secretary. And the guy starts going up and down the country and recruiting for the first time lots and lots of black people in the South. The chapters start popping up in the South all over. And when 1919 hits, I mean, the fastest growing state chapter in the NAACP is in Texas. But there's chapters popping up everywhere. I mean, the smallest town in Alabama is starting to have an NAACP chapter. And it's largely due to Johnson and also Walter White, who was a very young man at the time, who he had recruited. And White at that time was basically working he was recruiting, and he was also working as an investigator. So he would go to areas where there had just been violence, and he could pass. He was light-skinned, and he had blue eyes, and he could pass for White. And he would go in and risk his life to gather information about what had happened and expose it and write about it. Very risky job, as you can imagine. And those three men really transformed the organization. I mean, membership doubled, and they just really made it a very powerful organization. And their agenda, the political agenda, if you read it, reads like the Civil Rights Movement agenda that would come decades later. And you have speeches. There's one speech that I like to quote from James Weldon Johnson he gives in November. But half of it sounds like Malcolm X, half of it sounds like Martin Luther King. I mean, it depends, and he's saying these things before both men are born.
Again, context of white supremacy, our guest, Cameron McWhirter, author of Red Summer. I want to kind of hop to some of the incidents that took place in detail a little bit, and I actually want to start with Chicago, because I think so many people, they think, as you stated, they think of race riots, and they think of, Mississippi or Georgia or someplace in the South. But I'm skipping over D.C. just because you covered that in the Book TV broadcast, and folks can check that out.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that I point this out because I think this is super important. Someone who has made just immense contributions to black people and their fight against racism, white supremacy, was almost lost in the D.C. rioting. Mr. Carter G. Woodson, you include in the book, this is on page 99. This is during the rioting in Washington, D.C. That night, Carter Godwin Woodson, the dean of Howard University and a pioneer of African-American history, ran into a white mob while walking home near the Capitol. Woodson ducked into a store entranceway and watched servicemen chase a black man who screamed for mercy. As Woodson emerged from the shadows, he witnessed what he called the most harrowing spectacle he had ever seen. The mob caught the black man and hoisted him up as one would a beef for slaughter, then shot him. Woodson sneaked away, trying not to draw attention to himself. This was some years before he published Miseducation of the Negro. Would have been, an incredible tragedy if anything had happened where he wouldn't have been able to write that book. I just wanted to make sure listeners.
Well, and also, I think that's crucial to understanding more broadly, because I think, as you said earlier, 1919's really kind of been forgotten by black and white people. I mean, a lot of people don't. You'll read history books, and this is one of the reasons I wrote the book. Is you'll read history books, and there'll be a paragraph that says, and then there was the Red Summer in 1919. It was really there were a lot of crazy riots. Anyways, and then there was the Jazz Age, and then they go on. And I think, Woodson couldn't go on from his life without remembering that incident. It left an imprint on what he wanted to do with his life, with how he, what he would write and how he would write it. And I think that's true certainly for Claude McKay. If We Must Die became his most famous poem, and it certainly shaped his view of race relations. That whole summer did. And that's true for many, many other African Americans, James Weldon Johnson included.
Absolutely. As I said, Chicago, I think it's very important. The riot in Chicago took place July 1919, and this starts swimming, very hot day, summertime. Folks are at the beach. Some black people, they kind of drift over to the white section. Some white people, or one white person, begins throwing some rocks at some of the black youngsters who are swimming. I wanted to fill in some more of the details. I just want to read. This is on page 130. This is actually from a novel, but as you write, this comes pretty close to some of the things that actually went down.
Is this James T. Farrell?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, all right.
Yes, sir. This is from his novel, Studs Lonergan, and he writes, Tommy Doyle said the niggers were never going to forget the month of July 1919. Studs said that they ought to hang every nigger in the city to the telephone poles and let them swing there in the breeze. Benny Tate said that for every white man killed in the riots, 10 black apes ought to be massacred. Very interesting passage, and unfortunately, as I said, it comes pretty close to the sentiment and what was going on in Chicago, July 1919. Can you kind of take it from there?
You're right, and there was that. I have two chapters on Chicago, and the second chapter, as you point out, is literally just sort of what went down when the riot erupted, and it begins at that beach. But that beach incident, which was a horrible incident, was really just the flashpoint but the tinder had been laid down there for years, and it was between, it was what I was referring to earlier, where black people were moving in large numbers up to Chicago, and they were getting jobs in the stockyards because there was a huge demand for labor, but they weren't allowed to live outside of the Black Belt, so they were cramped in there, and every time, the stockyards were not near where they were allowed to live, so they had to walk. If you were a black worker working in the stockyards, which, by the way, whether you're white or black, it was nasty work. You're slaughtering cattle every day. That's your job. And there were various jobs at the stockyards, all of them bad. So you're walking or taking the trolley every day through the white area. So whenever there's racial disturbance, you're getting beaten. You're risking your life to get home to and from work. And when these riots erupt, there were black people working all over the city, whether they were in the stockyards, where most of them worked, but also there were black waiters in the Loop, black people working in the post office, wherever, all over the city, and mostly menial jobs. But when this racial violence erupts, they're on the wrong side of the line, and they got to try to get home. And then, during the days that took place, the days that riot erupted, people were stuck inside the Black Belt, so they couldn't. There wasn't anyone delivering food or ice or water. Again, it's July in Chicago, which is boiling hot, and so it was basically they were surrounded, and it wasn't for days before. Finally, the Chicago mayor asked for state aid, that the state National Guard came in and was able to get supplies into the Black Belt and end the riot. But it was absolute, that portrayal, I put that in there because Farrell was writing honestly about how young Irish teens were thinking at the time, and they were one of the main groups leading these riots. There had been fights between black and white youths in the parks on the south side for years, and once the riot erupted, it was an excuse to pick up a baseball bat or a lead pipe and head out and just attack anybody they could find.
You talk about, and I think this is also a recurrent theme in the book. This is actually on page 144. Most white troops thought blacks were at fault until they arrived on the scene. Many went down, talking about the troops, thinking that Negroes were the most to blame, and it was the intention of the company to clean them up, said Henry McNamara, a militia member from Chicago's North Side. A change of opinion came as the men got on their job. Sterling Morton, a militia captain who lived in the all-white suburb of Winnetka, jokingly referred to his assignment as the African Campaign. He described the eerie experience of his first patrol through a mixed block on South Wells. All the streetlights were shot out. The homes of black families were smoldering. Bits of furniture and shattered telephone coin boxes lay in the streets. The houses deserted by the Negroes had been looted, and in many cases, Victrolas, then an evidence of affluence, had been smashed or pulled out to the curb and burned, Morton recalled. Troops found blacks thankful for their arrival. Generally speaking, the Negroes were orderly after the initial riots, in which they acted largely in self-defense, aggravated by a very real fear of a general massacre. White mobs did not disperse easily. Neighborhood gangs gathered and jeered, as did some Army veterans who taunted the guardsmen with chants of 10 soldiers. But the bluster of thugs was empty and short-lived. And I think that passage, I think, is very indicative of what happened during a lot of these incidents where the media, white people come out and blame black people for all this and say they started it. These uppity Negroes have come back from the war and they don't know their place. But then when you actually investigate, it's white people who are the aggressors and they're going out just to slaughter innocent black people.
Yeah, I mean, if you look, you've read the book carefully, as I can tell, and you've seen that there was over and over again, there was, there would be a headline that would say, Negro uprising. Well, no, that's not what happened at all. The facts were, what's wrong with the Negroes? What's wrong with what's going on? Well, the answer was nothing was going on. They were being attacked. It wasn't black people inciting this trouble. It was white people, and it was Omaha, Omaha, Nebraska. There was a criminal act. A woman was assaulted, and they blamed the black man who was arrested for the crime. Then a white mob gathers, destroys the downtown courthouse, kills him, crucifies the man who was accused of the crime, although he never had a trial. And then they proceed to smash up the town. And then everyone later is speculating, well, what was wrong with the black people? Why? Maybe they're being influenced by the industrial workers of the world or the anarchists or the communists. What's going on? Well, nothing was going on with black people. It was a white mob that gathered and destroyed the downtown courthouse. And this happened in various other places as well, but there was a general perception by a large part of the media and more importantly, by a large part of the federal government. There was a very young J. Edgar Hoover who was working for the Attorney General at the time, and he was convinced and became further convinced, as we all know, later in life, that throughout his life, that if there was black political activity, had to have behind it some sort of Svengali communist, some sort of sinister radical must be manipulating black political activity. And he certainly began to espouse that in 1919 in federal reports, but certainly I would say that was absolutely not the case. And I think that I'll go even farther to say I think that after researching this book, I think a lot of modern scholars, black and white, tend to look they tend to look romantically back at radical black people at the time who did embrace communist ideas. So, for example, Hubert Harrison, who was a very good writer and was a radical socialist. His influence, and his influence has actually been greatly exaggerated. When in fact people like James Weldon Johnson, who was certainly within the realm of American politics much more of a mainstream person, I think had much more influence and helped shape African American political thought much greater than Hubert Harrison ever did.
Well, I also want to point out Walter White. He came to Chicago just for anyone. I know I've been in this camp myself and saying, oh, the NAACP, they don't really do anything, or they're controlled by white people, or what have you. Just make sure they get their kudos for the dangerous work they were involved in at this time. Walter, this is on page 142. Racial confusion abounded. Muddling the color line, whites were so fiercely trying to enforce. Light-skinned blacks walked through the loop unmolested, but were attacked by blacks as they returned to the black belt. Even Walter White claimed that a black man shot at him, mistaking him for a Caucasian. And that's not the only incident of violence and danger that Mr. White faced, but I wanted to make sure he got his kudos. Extremely dangerous.
Oh yeah, no, he's an interesting guy too, and I definitely think that you can, this is not a history of the NAACP, and certainly it had its ups and downs. I think my argument would be that before 1919, and certainly from its beginning to about 1916, it was kind of a sort of a do-gooderish, well-meaning but pretty small group dominated by white people. I think it had its ups and downs after 1919, certainly. And the Civil Rights Movement was not completed by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was not accomplished by the NAACP. But you got to give them their props because they did some amazing stuff back in that time period, and they really set an agenda, I argue, that was ultimately fulfilled.
I want to make sure I read some more of the dangerous work that Mr. White carried out.
Let's talk about my favorite anecdote, which was when he goes to Arkansas, and he actually convinces the governor that he's white, that he's a white journalist, and who sits down with him and writes out a letter of introduction for him, and then he actually goes to the town and he's walking around investigating, and they find out that he's there, and they say. A black man whispers and gets him into an alley and says, "You got to get out of here because they're going to kill you." And he runs to the train, gets on the train, and at that time they would call a light-skinned black person would be called a yellow Negro, right? And sometimes they wouldn't use the word Negro, but yellow, right? So he gets on the train, and the white conductor, takes his ticket and says, "Why are you leaving? We were just about to lynch a yellow Negro. You're going to miss the show," And that's, if he'd even looked at him, he could have been dead 1,000,000 times over. And there were white people with the NAACP who risked their lives as well. There was a young man named Herbert Seligman, a Jewish man from New York, who went to Vicksburg and interviewed tons of white people and wrote up an amazing report. And he could have, if these guys knew, the NAACP, like you said, is perceived by a lot of people today as sort of mainstream and, dominated by whites or whatever. But, Walter White would have been killed in an instant. He would have been lynched. Seligman would have been lynched. James Weldon Johnson was down there during the Washington riots, could have been killed. John Shulady, a white man who was then the secretary of the organization, goes down. Texas, as I mentioned, was the fastest growing state chapter of the NAACP. So the state government there tries to shut it down. And Shulady goes down there to Austin, where I just was actually for a book reading, and tries to make sure that doesn't happen. And he comes out of his hotel, and he's attacked in the middle of the day by a white mob that includes a local judge and a local constable. And they beat the hell out of him. They beat him bloody and sent him packing on a train. Imagine if that happened today. The outcry that would come out of that.
I want to double check. I think my co-host, Justice, I think she might have some questions as well. I just want to get in the white member of the NAACP, Mr. Shulady, if I'm saying his name correctly. They bragged, the white people who molested and terrorized him, they bragged about this beating after he left and were proud of it. Said that was the correct thing to do, and they would do it to any white person.
Yeah, and people go to the governor, Hobby at the time, and said, "Hey, what do you think of this?" And he's like, "Well, hey, the guy shouldn't have been down here stirring up trouble among our Negroes." Like, that's his answer. Imagine, again, I completely, we could sit and talk for hours about current problems that we have. I get it. But imagine if that went down today. There'd be not that we don't have huge racial issues, but if the stuff that governments, my chapter on Ellisville, Mississippi, where John Hartfield is executed in broad daylight, and it's announced in advance. It's not announced that a man is lynched. It's announced that a man will be lynched. And the NAACP pleads with the federal government. Government says it's a state issue. They plead with the governor, Bilbo, who was an avowed racist, and he says, "Well, he raped a white woman, so what am I going to do? How can I stop that? How can I stop them from lynching him?" Well, number one, he wasn't convicted of the crime. He was never even actually charged with the crime. He was never formally charged in a court. So we don't know if he ever did it or didn't do it. Number one. Number two, you're the leader, the political leader of the state. You should be able to intervene and stop a crime, a gigantic crime in which as many as 10,000 people attended to see the slaughter of a man in broad daylight.
Context of white supremacy. Again, our guest, Mr. Cameron McWhirter. You can visit his website as well, CameronMcWhirter.com. It's linked in the description. You can visit the website and also check out his spot on Book TV. Very interesting. Justice, if you have some questions for Mr. McWhirter, your line should be open. Want to make sure I give out the number as well for folks who are listening in. If you want to call in, if you have a question, or if you just want to listen on your phone, the number to dial, 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Justice, if you have some questions, your line should be open. Please proceed.
Can I be heard, and can I be heard clearly?
I can hear you.
Okay. Greetings, Mr. McWhirter. Is that how you pronounce it? Okay.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Why do you like talking about Red Summer, and why did you write the book, Red Summer?
Well, I talk about it because I wrote about it. I think that it's a critical point. It's a critical watershed in American history, and on a broader level, I would say, I've been interested in American history for my life, and if you study American history, you have to understand that race is critically entwined in that, or how we deal with race. Black people were brought here as slaves in 1619, and in 1919, 300 years later, there's all this violence erupts because we never really figured it out. We never really figured out how black people and white people are going to interact in society, and in an equitable way and in a peaceful way. And so I've been fascinated by why how does society break down where either ethnically or racially there's violence? So when I was in Africa as a younger man, I saw a lot of ethnic strife in the Sudan and in Eritrea and Ethiopia and in Kenya, and how that violence, how society could break down to that point was always fascinating to me, and I couldn't figure out how do you prevent it. And then when I came back to the United States, I saw that same kind of a lot of ethnic divisions and racial divisions here as well. And later I was a reporter in Bosnia, and there was a lot of ethnic bloodshed there. And then in every city I've ever worked in the United States, there's, if you study the history of those cities, there was a major race riot. So I just wondered, why is this happening? Why? And when you start studying the violence in the United States, 1919 jumps out as the worst spate of this kind of trouble. So that's my long-winded answer.
Why do you why do you refer to these rare riots and lynchings as an epic encounter on your website?
Oh, because it was this classic conflict between it was this classic nationwide spasm of violence, and then there was this epic response from black people, and that really, as Gus was talking about, I mean, that was really this transformation into a what I would argue was the beginning of the civil rights movement.
Okay. What I really meant was race riots, but do you think your book? Okay. Do you think your book is constructive in working against racism, white supremacy? If so, how?
Well, I mean, we talked about white supremacy earlier. You guys, I think Gus has a different view of the current state of things than I do. But I would say I think the book is constructive in the sense that it exposes a part of history that people have forgotten, which is always good. And I also think it shows that the seeds of black political action, which eventually would lead to the civil rights movement. So, and I think there are these heroes that people don't give enough attention to. For example, as I've been talking about tonight, James Weldon Johnson. I think he's a person that every American should know a lot about, and he really was extraordinary on many levels. But primarily, or one of his primary assets was that he fought. He believed in the United States government, in the Constitution, and he fought very hard to make sure that equality was achieved. Now, he didn't see it in his own lifetime. Maybe nobody has yet, but he fought for that, and he fought for it throughout his life.
It shows a map on your website of the major. It shows a map on your website of the major race riots and lynchings of the Red Summer through April and November of 1919. What is the difference between a major race riot and a minor race riot?
Right, that's a good question, and it's a great question because it's something I wrestled with, and obviously if you're the person caught in a minor race riot, but you're the one who's being beaten, it's major, right, to you. So that's something that was I basically if someone had to have been killed, and there had to have been major news coverage of the event. That was sort of my criteria. But it's amorphous. So there's incidents that I'm sure there were racial incidents that occurred in 1919 that occurred out of reach of a newspaper where no one ever heard about it. And we're just never going to know that. And I think one of the problems I had as a researcher was some racial incidents were very well covered. So like the Chicago riot there's a big commission that's set up, and they investigate everybody who died and how many people were wounded. And then there's Washington D.C., where it was so embarrassing to the city government that they just didn't really want to investigate it. So we never really had a clear understanding of exactly what happened. And then there's Arkansas, where in this county in Arkansas, Phillips County, they really wanted to cover it up. So we never have a real clear idea of how many people were killed, and it's probably in the hundreds. That's the best anyone can estimate. So your point is, your question is a very good one.
So I can get an idea of how big this was. How many race riots and lynchings, major and minor, took place in how many states?
Well, that's the thing. Like the map, like there's certain I don't know how many we'll just never know about. So there are incidents in. So I wrote about what I could confirm had happened, but I can never tell you, like for example, how many people died in the Red Summer because of racial violence. I don't know, and I don't know that anyone will ever know, because in so many areas, governments didn't want to participate. So I consider the lynching in Ellisville, Mississippi, to be a major event, but only one person was killed. But I consider it a major event because 10,000 people were there, according to news accounts. So it really, it was completely widespread. I mean, that I can tell you for a fact, because I know for a fact because of court records and because of newspaper accounts. There's an incident in San Francisco. There's a riot that takes place in Bisbee, Arizona, near where the Buffalo Soldiers were based. There's incidents in Texas, in Longview. Then there's that beating in Austin I told you about. There's lynchings all over Mississippi, lynchings in Alabama, lynchings in Georgia, lynchings in Florida. You know, there's this major race riot in Chicago, in which the south side of Chicago and the world's largest meatpacking district are shut down for a week. There's a slaughter in Omaha, Arkansas. There's a riot outside of the White House in Washington. There's trouble in Connecticut, Delaware. And even in the places where there weren't full-blown riots, there was tension. So in New York City, there was a lot of tension about that there would be a riot. There was tension in Savannah, Georgia, all over the place. Everybody was afraid.
Did black people, non-white people, fight back during the mistreatment of Red Summer white people? If so, how?
What do you mean? I'm sorry, can you restate it?
Did black people
fight back?
Yes, during the mistreatment of Red Summer. If so, how?
Definitely. Yeah. Well, quite literally, there were veterans, black veterans, who had come back in Washington when the Washington riot erupts in July of 1919, and they quickly go up and cordon off. They set up barricades and set up perimeters, military perimeters, and cordon off their blocks to protect their area. And I have accounts of that in the book. I mean, they defended in a military way their area, so they literally fought back. Also, at that time, one tactic used by mobs was what they called terror cars. So people would pile into a car, and the guys would, these old Model Ts like you'd see in a gangster movie, and they would hang out the side of the car on the sides and just shoot at anybody they saw as they drove down the street. And this, again, literally was perfected by the gangsters like Al Capone, who was living in Chicago at the time. But the white people started to use these tactics, so that's why black people started to set up barricades in these neighborhoods. And they also, there's at least one instance that I write about of black people using terror cars against white people. And then when the riot erupts in Chicago just a week later, there's numerous examples of black people, black gangs fighting back and attacking white people in the Black Belt, and then obviously the reverse was happening on a much larger scale, where white mobs were attacking black people outside of the Black Belt, which was the name given for the neighborhood where black people lived in Chicago. But so black people were fighting literally back there's an incident that I write about as a chapter I have on a riot that takes place in Knoxville, and in Tennessee, and the white mob attacks a courthouse looking for a black person who's been arrested and charged with a crime. The sheriff had gotten the person out of town, but the mob doesn't believe him, and they proceed to destroy the courthouse. And when they don't find anybody, they go down to attack the black neighborhood, and they're met by sharpshooters. Black people shoot back, and there's a big gun battle that takes place to the point where the Tennessee National Guard brings down machine guns and starts opening up machine guns into the black neighborhood. But they still don't capture it because black sharpshooters are shooting back. So on top of that, then there's what I was talking about earlier, which is black people fought back literally, but they also fought back in the courts. So when a bunch of people are arrested for what happened in Arkansas and are charged with crimes which were unfair, the NAACP and others raise money to hire lawyers to get the men who are falsely accused released. There is also and there's also political activity on a level never seen before, where the NAACP is really organizing and setting up chapters and pressuring politicians and lobbying Congress. And black people who aren't interested in the NAACP are doing all other kinds of things, like joining Marcus Garvey's organization or other political organizations. There's a huge outpouring of black political activity.
I've concluded that white people who practiced racism, white supremacy, often will withhold constructive information from non-white people. What were some of the less usual methods you use to collect data from the work you do?
Yeah, I'm not sure I get it. What's the question? I'm sorry.
How
did I gather my information?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, there are a whole host of ways. There's a lot of court records. There's a lot of newspaper accounts from various newspapers, black and white. The black press at that time was really growing. So the Chicago Defender, for example, was sort of the national black newspaper, but there were other black newspapers as well. And there are letters. There's huge files within the NAACP, and Marcus Garvey's letters and papers are all available. I mean, there's lots of research that is available. So I gathered as much as that as I could from various academic libraries. There wasn't really any electronic media at the time, and there was no commercial radio or anything at the time. So I think the biggest problem I faced was not anything conspiratorial. It was, well, maybe there's an element of conspiracy, but there were people who just, there's just incidents that took place and no one would want to talk about it. So I don't have any evidence, so I can't, and I didn't want, because of the subject matter, I didn't want to say anything in this book that I couldn't show had come from a source. So I was very careful to footnote a lot and make sure that information was in there and I could show it. And so, for example, like I said, in the Arkansas incident, it was presented by the media initially and by the local, certainly by the local white government, as to that they had, quote, suppressed a, quote, Negro uprising, that black people were organizing in a secret society to revolt and kill all the white people in the county. That was not true at all. But that's what was initially presented, and that's certainly what the news accounts were. Thankfully, Walter White and the NAACP went in there and exposed a lot of that, and there were certainly there were investigations and court documents that explored all of this later, and so I could use all that information. But really, for example, how many people died? How many black sharecroppers were killed in the cane fields of Phillips County? And I don't know, and no one knows, and no one was ever allowed to talk about it. So we just don't know. It just will never know. And I think as a historian, as a writer, that became frustrating on occasion as I tried to piece together what happened. Because, and this is true even if you're not, as a reporter, this is true no matter what. I mean, whether you're writing about race or not. But when you're reporting about an incident, there's always something more you'd want to get to flesh it out. And you run into not being able to. And these are incidents that occurred, 9 decades ago, and in many of the cases, nobody wanted to talk about it. So piecing it together was hard work.
Okay. That is all of my questions that I have for right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Context of white supremacy. I'll give out the number again in case folks want to dial in if you all have questions. That number again, 760-569-7676. And the code is 564-943#. I'll take some questions. Give me a hot minute. I want to spend some time on what happened with Arkansas because I think that is extremely important, and that's one of the race riots that I really didn't know anything about. I hadn't really heard anyone talk about it or mention it before. I just want to make sure that I throw in, as you said, a lot of these people, black people who fought back, who were not just going to take this terrorism and not do anything, to make sure I got some of the names that I guess are not as well known. A black teenager, this is during the D.C. riots, Carrie Minor Johnson. She was in her home. She was hiding under the bed, actually, and a white enforcement officer, a sergeant, broke into her bedroom, and she shot and killed him. And she actually was taken to trial. She eventually was convicted of manslaughter, had that overturned, and she was released. I thought that was incredible for a black female teenager to shoot and kill a sergeant, and ultimately.
But importantly, like, she wasn't, at least her representation of what happened, she wasn't. She didn't think there was a cop kicking in the door. She just thought it was white mobs kicking in the door. That's the thing. It's like, she wasn't. She wasn't out to kill a police officer. She thought I think she was with her father at the time, cowering under the bed, and they didn't know who was kicking in the door. At least that's what she told a jury, and the jury eventually, the courts eventually believed her. So, again, this goes to my point. This wasn't, I think we have these views of, through white people and through scholars and sometimes black activist groups that sort of grew out of the 60s. They see all this, they see, this violence had to somehow be revolutionary or radical or black people rebelling. No, these are black people who wanted to be part of America, and they expected to be part of America, and they wanted to participate freely and equally in American society. And they got caught up in a whole lot of mess, and they, instead of buckling under from all the pressure that was applied to them, they fought back. And so, again, I'm going to sound like I'm waving an American flag, and I am, because I think it's an amazing fact that African Americans stood their ground and fought to be part of this country. And my ancestors came from a whole host of places, and I have a little Native American blood, so I guess they were already here. But they came to this country, and they had their struggles, and then they were here, right? African Americans came here as slaves, and through hundreds of years have had to fight to get equal status here. And that 1919 to me is an extraordinary example of that process.
There's so many anecdotes, very well researched book. Want to toss in one more before I get to Arkansas. This is going back to what happened in Chicago. And I had a big smile. I had just been doing some research to dig out some of the work of Roy Ottley, he also wrote No Green Pastures, where he's talking about how black people who went to Europe, they were trying to get away from America to escape racism, and not going to happen. Ran into it when they went to Europe as well. But this is on page 135. Just real incredible passage. I want to read a bit of this just to share. And I think it touches on what you just talked about with Miss Johnson and many other black people who were just trying to defend themselves. They thought that they were in jeopardy of, being crucified by these white terrorist mobs. This is a 135, again, in reference to what happened in Chicago. Black journalist Roy Otley recounted the story of one anonymous victim, again, a veteran, Black Army veteran who served 10 months overseas and was a clergyman's son. The man was heading home from a plant on the outskirts of the city when he stopped at an intersection to transfer to a streetcar bound for the south side. A group of 20 whites saw him. One yelled, "There's a nigger. Let's get him." He jumped onto a trolley, but the mob yanked down the pole from the power line. The motorman opened the rear door, and the black man took off, running as fast as he could. He ran for 3 blocks and threw away his jacket. Someone tried to trip him, but he jumped into the gutter and got away. He ran into a pharmacy for protection, but a white woman made him leave. He took off running again. My strength was fast failing, the black man recalled. The idea came in my head to stop and give up or try to fight, but the odds were too great, so I kept running. My legs began to wobble, my breath came harder, and my heart was pounding like a big pump while they crept up on me. He outran the mob, but 2 whites fired guns at him. The man hid for several hours, and for the first time, it all sank in. The injustice of the whole thing overwhelmed me, and my feelings ran riot, he said. Had the 10 months I spent in France been all in vain? What had I done to deserve such treatment? I lay there trying to imagine how the innocent victim of a Southern mob must feel. Must a Negro always suffer because of his skin? There's a nigger. Let's get him. Those words kept ringing in my ears. He huddled in a dark alley and prayed to God to get home safely, then loaded his pockets with rocks for ammunition and headed home. When he saw Comiskey Park, where the White Sox played baseball, he knew he was safe. It had taken him 5.5 hours to get home. Later, he saw a white heading to work. My first impulse was to jump on him and beat him up, he said. Incredible anecdote, Roy Otley.
Yeah, I love that anecdote because, there's a lot of police reports I have, there's a lot of newspaper accounts, and there's there's very few that take you in the mind of someone being pursued. So like if I'm writing about the lynching, for example, John Hartfield, who was murdered in Mississippi, I don't know what it was. I can certainly assume the horrors that were going through his mind as he was killed, but I don't know really what he was thinking as he was being chased, and that captured it for me. So that's why I put that in the book. But he, and also just on a side, Roy Otley he becomes a sort of a fascinating journalist throughout the 20th century. A new book, I just reviewed a book of his notebooks when he was when he went over to Europe during World War II, and served as a journalist, writing for various publications, and that's pretty interesting reading. So I suggest you take a look at that.
What's the title of that one?
It's called something like Roy Otley's Notebooks. I'll get it for you, but it's put out, I think, by the University of Kansas.
Okay, Roy Otley's Notebook. I would love to take a look at that.
Yeah, it's definitely, he's an interesting guy, it's interesting how he's writing about race in the heavily censored journalism of World War II. Mm-hmm. And he has his notebooks, and then they also quote, they have what he wrote, which, what he actually published, and it could be very different.
Wow. Okay. I definitely, like I said, I want to make sure to touch on Arkansas. Super important, and as you said, we don't even really have an accurate tally for the deaths and how many people suffered through this. This is, as we talked about at the very beginning, you have black people in this area. They're farming and they're trying to maximize their income. They don't want to be gypped. Cotton prices are soaring, and they're just trying to organize to make. They're not organizing to kill white people. They're not organizing to go out and terrorize anyone. Just want to get adequate compensation for selling our produce, our cotton. And this all starts. I think you have a meeting of black people. They've gathered to discuss this, and they have guns. They have some fear that, white people might come and try to do something to us, but they're not organizing for violence. They're just organizing to try to get the best price they can for their cotton. And
it was an organization that called itself a union, but really it was sort of like a cross between a union and a Masonic order, So they had some secretive stuff, like secret handshakes and stuff like that or something, but it wasn't, it was not out to slaughter. There's no evidence that it was a plot to kill all the white people in the county. I don't know how that would achieve any political end anyways, but that certainly wasn't the case. And then there was some pathetic assertions that, the industrial workers of the world were involved. That it makes no sense, and that's baseless. But, people didn't want to, they wanted to make sure they got good prices for their cotton. And certainly if they formed a cooperative, a collective bargaining situation, they would have been able to do that, and that did not sit well with white merchants who controlled the cotton that came in and out of the county. Now, there also, I think there was a hysteria on the part of white people. We talked about it a little earlier, but there was this general hysteria by white people of, blacks are rioting and acting, they're causing these riots, and they're organizing into radical units, and and then there's this global, white civilization's under attack, right? So when this incident does happen at Hoopsburg Church, there's this shooting, and then it becomes, the blacks have started an uprising. And the response is to form white posses that start marching up and down through the cane breaks, shooting people. And because it was so, then later soldiers come and basically join in shooting instead of stopping the violence like they did in Illinois or in Washington, D.C. They basically participate in it, and it's a massacre. And, they would say, these men were armed. Well, very often that was not the case. But also, if you're a farmer in rural Arkansas, you're going to have a shotgun, right? Because you're going to shoot varmints or whatever, or you're going to go rabbit hunting or whatever. So guys would have shotguns, but there wasn't. So if you kill a man, if you go up and you kill a man and they say, hey, he had a shotgun, that's not really evidence that he was in revolt, And nobody wanted to investigate this afterwards. There was a distinct effort. They rounded up lots of black people, shot a lot of black people, but rounded up lots more, and then they proceeded to elicit, quote, confessions of this conspiracy, which were exposed later to have been massive beatings by local authorities and this sort of de facto government that was established in the town, and they just beat the hell out of people until they, quote, confessed, unquote, to things that didn't happen. And eventually, through a lot of fights in the courts, with the help of the NAACP, those cases were thrown out and the men were freed.
Mm-hmm. I want to make sure Ida B. Wells, definitely, she is a longtime soldier against lynching, racism, white supremacy. She also contributed to the effort to help out.
That's true. And I've had people in some of my talk, when I give talks around the country, particularly women will jump me if I don't mention her. So thank you for pointing her out. Yes, she was, one thing I would say is, we mentioned the three men in the NAACP who helped transform it in 1919. They did do that, and I think Ida B. Wells did amazing work in her lifetime, but really by 1919 she was not as strongly present as she had been in the past. So I mention her in the book several times, but her participation, for example, in the aftermath of the Chicago riot is limited. I think because of some infighting, she had sort of fallen out with the NAACP, and she was getting older, so she wasn't as present as she had been in past situations.
Wow. This, I just wanted listeners to know, in this particular incident in Arkansas, Phillips County, you actually have the governor, Charles Breaux, actually riding in with some of the troops on this so he can kind of observe things firsthand, just so you can kind of get an idea of just widespread culpability in this. This is not just, a couple hooligans out on the street or what have you. You've actually got the governor.
Oh, no, yeah. And that's where I again, going back to the very beginning with your remarks about white world supremacy or white conspiracy, again, we can talk about what the current situation is, but if you look at what was going on then, I mean, you had the governor riding in with troops. He thinks he's there to put down a black insurrection. And as we were discussing, there was no black insurrection at all. And then there proceeds to be a slaughter. And he returns to the state capitol as a conquering hero. Well, I put that down. I put down that insurrection. Well, wait a minute. There never was one. And eventually, through the NAACP and others, Walter White, it's shown that was a lot of bunk.
I wanted just to give people an idea. I mean, we were talking earlier about, put this in quotes, minor race riot, major race riot. This, I think, definitely has to qualify for major race riot. You have on page 225 conservative estimates for the number of black people killed at 25. And then you have a white Arkansas journalist, L. Sharp Dunway, claimed in 1925 that 856 blacks were killed, most by federal troops. Do you think it's possible that nearly 1,000 black people were killed during this riot?
I think it's possible. And again, as I've said, unfortunately, I think we'll never know. And this is scholars have run into this problem. For example, I'm sure on your program you've talked in the past about the Tulsa riot, 1921, where there was a race riot in which the white mobs basically destroyed the Greenwood section of Tulsa. And there have been wild speculations as to how many people were killed there. No one will ever know. We don't, because they didn't want to report. They didn't want to investigate it afterwards. So we just don't know. And out in the canebrakes in the rural areas of Arkansas in 1919, you see, somebody comes upon a black person and shoots him. How are we ever going to know, And so I think that is kind of an extreme. I put it in there as sort of an extreme estimate, but I thought it was interesting that he was white and segregated. He was a segregationist, the man who wrote that. So why would he write that if he was? Why would he write that? It has to be the question. But I think certainly several hundred people could easily have been killed. I think 25 is absurdly low. But we just don't know. Whereas in Chicago, we know that 38 people were killed. Now, how many more? We have a number of how many people, hundreds of people. They give a specific number of how many people were wounded, but that's really only people who showed up at certain hospitals, and we just don't know. But we can say that 38 people were killed in Chicago.
I remember Elliot Jaspin, author of Buried in the Bitter Waters, he talked about that as well, because he's same subject matter, and he was saying that it's difficult to get accurate records of what happened during these racial cleansings or riots, because you've got so many people that are fleeing for their lives. You don't know if they were killed or if they just, got as far away as they could and relocated to another city. So it's kind of difficult to gauge, accurate numbers about what happened. But
yeah, and again, I wanted to write a book that, if I'm sitting down with Joe and Janet America and a Black Panther and a Ku Klux Klansman, we can go through the book, and no one can dispute what my sources were. You know what I mean? I wanted to be very, look, this is what happened. So I don't want anyone, I didn't want anyone to read the book and say, oh, well, this guy's just, he's an apologist for black people. He's just making this up. No, I'm not. It's all here. You can follow the sources. And I wanted that to be indisputable. And I think I did it because there's so many footnotes in the book, as you noticed. But because these events really happen, and that's America needs to know that, And this isn't some polemical book at all. It's a book recounting factual events.
Wow. I want to make an important point. I want to try and connect why, at least for me, why I think this book and your research is extremely important, especially for black people in this area of the world, the United States. I'll let folks know if you're on the phone lines, if you have questions, if you're on the free HD line, it's *6. If you have a question, if you're on the talk shoe line, it's *8. I'll be going to the phone lines. So let me get this last point in. I think this is critically important information for black people in this area of the world because, as I said at the beginning, and we don't have agreement on this, but I feel certainly we have a lot of refinement. You certainly don't have the same type of racism, white supremacy that you documented in 1919. It's a lot more refined. It's a lot more subtle. However, I definitely see a lot of potential and even some evidence that this sort of thing could happen again. And what I would point to, I still see the tendency among many white people to blame black people for things, even when there's no evidence. As you stated, no evidence at all. What happened in Arkansas, you've got white people saying, oh my gosh, there's a Negro insurrection, these uppity black people, no evidence that they were out to kill black people. I see that tendency right now. And I just, to point out two examples from your book of this, which I thought were, I can't really say hilarious, but indicative of the point. This is on 77. You were talking about Father Divine, Morgan J. Divine, where some white people got into an argument. And you write on 77, the argument between the two escalated until one of the men decided to move. He listed his home for sale explicitly to a colored buyer to spite his neighbor.
Yeah, I thought that was funny.
You have another example. I mean, it's funny as well, but I mean, racist man. This on page 234, you write, as October 1919 came to a close, the town of Corbin in central Kentucky evicted almost its entire black population in one night. After a white man there was robbed and stabbed, rumors spread that the assailants were black, though it was later shown the attackers were white men in black face. Now, anyone, if you can think Charles Stewart in Boston, Sharon Smith blaming a black person, I mean, this sort of thing happens regularly.
No, Fear of a Black Planet, yeah. No, it definitely, yeah.
If you even want to think,
Corbin is less funny than the two guys fighting on Long Island.
I want to make one point. I just want to make one point, and then I want to hear your response, because I see this on a larger scale. Not the Sharon Smith example is with one individual. I see this on a larger scale where entire groups of black people get blamed. You work with the Wall Street Journal. Those subprime loans, I heard tons of white people saying the economic crisis, it's black people's fault. We gave out all those faulty loans to the black people. They knew they couldn't get a job. They're lazy. They're not going to pay them back. I heard tons of white people saying that. President Obama being blamed. It's his fault. Got that ape. I've heard tons of that. That ape in the White House. He's messing everything up for us.
Man, I think you and I are listening to different radio stations.
You haven't heard any of it?
No, I haven't heard any of that. Not that it's, but I'm sure it's not. I'm sure that there are racial. There's definitely. I certainly have never heard that regarding the subprime loans, but I'm sure somebody's said that. But I've never heard that. But as for Obama, yeah, I'm sure Obama's gotten a lot of racist. He's been subjected to racism, and probably certainly his whole life, and certainly now that he's president, he's probably a target of it. I don't know that. I mean, I don't know why he would be responsible for the economic mess we're in. any more than any other political leader.
Wow. There are tons of articles. All you have to do is put in subprime loans racism. Do a Google search on it.
I mean, that's,
you will find
I work in the South. You know, I could work around I could travel around the South, and so I'm for my job, and so I'm seeing mortgaged homes all the time. And there's a lot of black people who've lost their homes, and there's a ton of white people who've lost their homes. So, and I don't think, at least my estimation of the subprime loan mess is that it crossed racial bounds. It was where anybody thought they could make a buck, you know. And certainly Atlanta has been hammered by the recession, and it's hit black people really hard, and it's hit white people really hard too. But again, of course, there's racists out there. That's for sure. And so I guess going to my our earlier mild disagreement is that, yeah, there's racism for sure. I mean, of course, but the ingrained institutional racism, racial barriers have been largely blown away in terms of the government and also in terms of what people can openly say and what they can't. And I think, and what actions can happen and what can't. Now, there's a refinement is one thing, but openly lynching a person in broad daylight, you can't do that. There'd be a revolution if you did that. But then people have made the argument, well, look at our prisons and look at the minority imbalance in the representation of minorities in our prisons. That's another discussion, and I think it's worth a lot of discussion. But I was stunned by the things I was finding in 1919. I mean, again, like you pointed out, the governor is riding in with these troops, oversees a slaughter, and then goes back as a conquering hero. The governor is asked to stop what he knows will be a public lynching of a human being, in broad daylight, in what can only be called some sort of county festival, and he refuses to. You know, I mean, those kinds of things can't happen today.
I guess what I'm asserting, I think that could happen, and I think if you look at Katrina...
Well, yeah, maybe. Hang on. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm right.
I want to finish this. Katrina 2005. Very close. Very, very close. A.C. Thompson, he's a white man. He went there, and you pretty much had almost the same thing did happen. He has video of white people bragging about killing black people. He has video of white people saying you had white people coming from all over. They didn't even live in New Orleans. He said some of them didn't even live in the state of Louisiana, and they came for the opportunity to hunt and kill black people. That sounds almost identical to what you write about, and this is 2000.
That's exactly what happened in Arkansas. That's one thing we haven't mentioned is that the white posses that come in to Arkansas weren't just from Phillips County. They were from other counties in Arkansas, and they were from neighboring Mississippi. And they came in exactly to do that, to hunt down, quote, Negro insurrectionists, unquote, of which there were none, because none of them were revolting.
Identical to New Orleans 2005, post-Katrina, the black looters, they're raping babies. None of that can be substantiated about the raping babies where you got white people. And like I said, he has video. A.C. Thompson, he did an 18-month investigative report. He went down there. At least 11 black fatalities. Black males were shot and killed. He even had some arrests where police, that same thing you wrote about, police are participating in this. They're encouraging.
Well, there's the Danziger Bridge incident, which has already been litigated.
Exactly. Yeah. There were other incidents of this as well. I'm saying this to listeners. I would advise you all to pay very careful attention. I could easily see this happening again, especially with the economy in this situation. You've got a non-white person, President Obama in the White House. I could easily see a situation where white people blame black people for problems. Black people end up being scapegoated, and it becomes acceptable for this sort of thing to happen. Again, 2005 New Orleans, you did have that. It just didn't get the same sort of media coverage as everything else that was happening during Hurricane Katrina. But I would not be surprised at all with this sort of climate, same kind of storm.
The same economic tension, world tension. I hope, let's just leave it at this, I hope you're totally wrong.
Me too.
I hope.
Me too.
With the word hope, yeah.
I will quote, before I hit the phone lines, I will quote one of my favorite passages. The greatest pathology in the world is to believe in something just because you wish it to be so.
Yeah.
Let's see. I will check the phone lines if folks have any questions for Cameron McWhirter. Again, you can check his website, CameronMcWhirter.com, CameronMcWhirter.com. He has more information about the book, as well as, background information. If you're on the free HD line, it's star 6. If you're on the talk shoe line, star 8. Let me double check here. When I'm looking for hands, I'll make sure I get in my question. Give me a moment to check the phone lines. You mentioned, never mind, I'll save it. The person who dialed in, last 4 digits, 8753. 8753. Did you have a question for Mr. McWhirter?
Yes, greetings. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. I just have one question. Can you define American for me, or what you deemed as being American?
Yeah, I would be someone who's a citizen of the United States of America. So I'm defining that literally as somebody who's a citizen of the United States of America, the government of the United States of America. So that would be it. And I think that it's a fairly simple definition, but one that was incredibly complicated in 1919 because black people were second-class citizens at best.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I'll look to see if we have some other folks who have questions. I will get in my questions. So I look at the phone line, see if other folks have any questions they want to ask. On 252, you mentioned or referenced the slaughter of Emmett Till, Mississippi, 1955, and talking about how you can notice the change in what happened in the lynching of Emmett Till as opposed to what took place in 1919. And you write that they did this, the white people who were involved, they did this under the cover of night and swore themselves to secrecy. Emmett Till's death made national headlines for months. Activists pursued his murderers for decades. 36 years earlier in Ellisville, Mississippi, thousands of respectable people, including politicians, reporters, and town leaders, gathered in broad daylight to watch as John Hartfield was tortured, shot to pieces, and burned. People collected body parts as souvenirs. No one was ever prosecuted. I'll definitely say you do have a trial with the case of Emmett Till, but I think to be accurate, you had white people gloating about the white perpetrators in this crime, and gloating.
Amongst themselves they were yapping about it, and but I mean, they knew that the government was on them. That's what my point is, that they knew that they didn't take the stand and brag about it. And in 1919, they're standing on, there's politicians standing on cars giving speeches, right next to where John Hartfield is slaughtered. Vote for me. I won't, let the Negroes do X, Y, and Z. They're bragging about, that they're there. They're in broad public, and it was a very different scenario. And again, the Emmett Till case is horrible, and the people who participated in it were evil. There's no question. It's just the environment that as I say in the book, Jim Crow continued long after 1919. Some people would argue it's still around, but it was on the defensive. That's my point. And I think even if you, accepting everything you've said tonight, I mean, it is on the defensive. The fact that we're talking about it is it's on the defensive, and I think it's not. We don't live in the world that was in 1919, and citizens, black and white, have much more secured rights than they did then, and Americans, as I said earlier, who happen to be African American, played a major role in making sure that happened. Played the major role in making sure that happened.
No argument there. Just, I think it's important to point out the perpetrators in the Emmett Till case, they did brag publicly. They did an interview in Look magazine where they were paid thousands of dollars, and there's video footage of this as well after the trial of them bragging about this. And I don't think anyone, I think, who was honest had any thought that they were going to be persecuted. All white jury, I don't think anyone thought that things had changed.
Right. But they weren't bragging. No one stood up and said, "I killed him." They said he was killed because he was, whatever. And the Look magazine thing, I think, was, if I remember correctly, this is not out of the time period that I was writing about, but the Look magazine piece, I believe, was it was sort of secretive that they had gotten that information, if I'm correct, right?
It was pretty public. Like I said, they have video footage of them, talking after the trial. Definitely after the trial. They didn't do this beforehand or on the stand, but after. So they have video footage of them. This wasn't anything that was hidden. People.
Well, they're not saying like, I killed him. No one ever said, yeah, I killed him at Till. I was there. I did it. They weren't saying I killed him. That would have ended them. Then they would have been tried again because you can't be. You would have been. That's an open confession.
I'm pulling it up now. I don't think they pulled very many. In fact, I'll take the next call, and that'll give me time to pull it up so I can double check to see if they actually said, "Yeah, we did such and such" in the article.
Yeah, I killed Joe Smith. I killed Emmett Till. Well, I mean, then there would be even in the context of the time, their lawyers would have told them to shut up.
The person who dialed in, last four digits, this person called in from a block number. If you called in from a block number and you have a hand up, your line should be open. Do you have a question for Mr. McWhirter?
Greetings. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Hey.
Greetings to your guest. I had my original question. I was going to ask you if you think that, when you were talking about the tenders, were basically, at one point you were talking about the tenders were ready to, set aflame. So I was going to ask you if you see, in the future or, now, do you see those tenders, being set up today, but you and Gus kind of got into it. I was going to ask you if you
but that's a great question, and I think for me to prognosticate, I would probably, I wouldn't be able to predict, but I do think that the potential for ethnic and racial violence around the world is always there. I'd like to think of a day when that won't be the case, but there's definitely, you have, there was just the rioting in London, in England. What was that? That just erupted. There's been racial incidences in Australia, France in recent years. I think there's potential for strife with Hispanic populations in the United States. This can happen, and it can happen quickly. And it really comes down to governments being aware of it and working hard to shut it down when it starts. And if they don't, then they're either participating in it or worse, they're turning a blind eye. Both of which leads to innocent people getting hurt, which is basically what all these stories are about. Is not about. It's about literally the man Gus, you were reading about, the guy running for his life, and he's just trying to get home from work. He's not. He fought as a soldier in World War I. He's home working at a factory, and he just wants to get home. He's not out to, change the world or start join the Black Panthers or start a world revolution or anything. He just wants to go home from a hard day's work, and instead he spends 5.5 hours running for his life. So can that happen again? That could happen again. I don't know. I think in many ways, white mobs forming in the United States on that scale can't happen again, at least in the foreseeable future. But violence can happen again, and racial violence can happen again.
I was thinking, I was listening to what you were saying. I was thinking maybe your book can possibly point out some kind of patterns. I think people might, want to read it and maybe see if there's some patterns in those situations that they can maybe take, not to so much look for, to just see what was the so-called tender. But I do have a question for you. During your travels, do you meet many black people, and do they have the same sentiment as you? Like, this can never happen again. I mean, what are black people saying? Like when you meet them as you travel around?
Oh yeah, no. I mean, I give talks where it's mixed crowds, or mostly black or mostly white, and black people that I've encountered mostly are interested in why they don't know more about this time in American history. Why did they, why have they not learned more about these incidents that happened? And that's the main thing that people are asking me about. Like, how could I grow up in Chicago and I'm 60 years old and I don't know about what happened on the south side of Chicago where I grew up in 1919? Or or people in some of the incidences that I write about in the South, people were never, they're maybe in their 60s or younger, and their elders never talked to them about any of this stuff because they were afraid, And so and this, we're talking, this one incident I start the book with in Jenkins County, Georgia, that happened, 90 years ago, and nobody will talk about it because it's too ugly. And that's all these years later. So people at the black church that was burned down, they rebuilt the church, but so the congregation, there's still a small congregation there. They didn't really know exactly what happened until I wrote about it. And that's because they were never allowed to really explore it because they couldn't ask. The white government didn't do any investigation of what happened afterwards because they didn't want to talk about it. So I think the main thing that black people have expressed to me is, I'm amazed that this stuff happened and that I didn't know about it.
Thank you for your answers, and
thanks for calling.
Thanks for your work. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, 909. You actually gave me a free moment to look. I didn't even get my search completed. I was in the Google search bar, and I had Emmett Till, Look, Confession. I didn't even get the rest out. Killer's Confession in Look magazine. I think that's pretty blunt. If you check, it says that they confessed to the killing and gave details in that Look magazine article where they were compensated. They were paid. Easy search. It's on PBS. Easy one. And I thought that was the case. Like, I was kind of surprised that you even, were thinking that they did.
How could they? Wow, I'm amazed, and I got to investigate that because they confessed to the crime. They admitted they did it in public for money.
Yeah, and I think, yes, and I think the loophole is if you take the stand, or even as long as you do not take the stand and say, we didn't kill him, you can come out, if you get acquitted, whatever happens in the trial, you can come out and then say, yes, we did it, as long as that's not perjury. Like if they had been asked on the stand, did you kill Emmett Till? If they had said no, and then after the trial they come out and say, yes, that's perjury, then you can be retried. But as long as that didn't happen, I don't think that's a crime. And this is explained. Like, I think they go into detail in one of the, I think it's in Eyes on the Prize, they go into detail about how they were able to do this, and it didn't hang them up legally. They couldn't be retried. It's double jeopardy. But yes, they confessed in that article. Like I said, it's video footage. I think they bragged about doing so. It's on PBS. It's on
I'm going to check it out. I'm going to check it out tonight as soon as we get off the air.
Absolutely. I can email you the PBS article on American Experiments. Let me double check to make sure I'm not botching, talking over folks if they have questions they want to get in. We have about 4 minutes left. Let's see here. If you're on the TalkShoe line, it's *8. Just making sure I didn't miss anybody over there. *8 on the TalkShoe line. If you're on the Free HD line, it's *6. I'll get my question in while you all are waiting to see if you have anything. You also had a part, this is on, get the correct page for the book, where you're talking about the trauma of 1919 and how people suffered as a result of this. This is on page 263, close to the end of the book here, where you write, the riots and chaos traumatized tens of thousands. Some were emotionally crushed. Two public examples, John Shillady, the NAACP's white executive secretary, who was beaten in Austin, and Omaha Mayor Edward Smith, almost killed by the mob outside his city's courthouse. Both drifted out of public life. Many others, politicians, business people, workers, also withdrew from fear or shame or disappointment. Others grew strident and angry after the violence. And I noted that pattern, I just mentioned, that is a pattern that I've seen. It reminded me of Viola Louiso, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, that frequently when there will be incidents of racism, white supremacy, in this book, many incidents, it will end up being white people that become the symbols for that racism. And I just thought that, wow, in this, where you have almost a whole year of terrorism popping up all across the country, that the two people who would be mentioned to be examples of the trauma that was inflicted on tens of thousands, mostly black people, end up being white people. I just wanted to get your comments on that.
Oh, well, I use those guys because they dropped out of public life, whereas then the two guys, and then obviously I go on to talk about James Weldon Johnson and the guys who, I mean, again, this points to James Weldon Johnson's amazing strength, is that he joins, he suffers through all this stuff, and he's still got his dukes up at the end of the year, and he goes on from there for years to head the NAACP and to keep politically active. Smith is an interesting guy because he really risked his life to save a black man and was hanged. And he only didn't die because he was pulled down at the last minute. And he's basically shell-shocked after that, and Shillady as well. So I felt those two guys were, I think it's important. It was important to note that white people suffered as well as black people in this chaos, and a lot of the black people that I write about, some of them go on to become political leaders. Some of them were killed. So that was the end of their experiences, period. So in the instance of Omaha, the man who was killed there, that's it. We never hear, we're never going to hear what he felt afterward again. I think also there's the whole, the racial tensions and what it did, the ugliness that it sowed in people's lives. I don't have the book right in front of me, but right around there where that part you were reading, I have Claude McKay talking to his white friend. Do you remember that section? They're talking.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, sir.
Yeah, and to me that was really poignant because it captured how, they're on two sides of this. They're caught in this ugly mess. And they're friends, and they've been friends for a while, and they may even have been lovers, who knows, and that's speculated. But they're because one's white and one's black, they know that if violence erupts, they're going to be on the other end. They're going to be on the other side of the line. And to me, that was really poignant in how ugly the country had gotten, and how it's how important it is to fight that kind of violence, to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, I'm looking at that section right now. I too thought that was an outstanding portion. I might share it once we get past the mark. There was somebody that called in with a question. I just saw him and it disappeared. I'm not sure if something happened. You got bumped off. We got like 30 seconds. If you can dial in really quick, if you have a quick question, I'll see if I can get your hand. I just saw him. I was going to get their line and I'm not seeing it anymore. I'll give out the website again. Give them a couple seconds. The website again, CameronMcWhirter.com. Cameron McWhirter, I'll spell it out, CameRon. McWhirter is McWhirter. CameronMcWhirter.com. Visit the website. You can view the book, other information. I would encourage non-white people, especially black people, if you're in the United States, you should check out this book. A lot of constructive information, and I think you should look for patterns. As 909 said, we don't agree on this. I definitely think this sort of thing could happen again, and I would say be on alert just with the economic crisis and people complaining in a very racist manner about President Obama. I definitely think it could happen again, particularly if things do not work out well with the economy, which I suspect it won't anytime soon. I don't see the caller. Mr. McWhirter, thank you for sharing a bit of your Thursday evening. Like I said, I learned a ton from the book. Really helpful information. I'm glad you were able to come on the program, and hope it was a constructive investment of your Thursday evening.
No, it was. It was great talking to you, and it was a great talk. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, sir. We'll be in touch. And look that Emmett Till up. Confession.
I'm hanging up the phone and going right now.
Got it. Thank you again, Mr. McWhirter.
And I'll send you that stuff about Roy Otley.
Please do. I would appreciate that.
Okay. Have a good night.
Sir. You too.
Bye-bye.
Context of white supremacy. Red Summer. I'll give out the full title. Red Summer, the Summer of 1919 and the Awakening of Black America. Lots of constructive information. As he said, lots of footnotes. You can kind of dig through the back and find other books, websites. Elliot Jaspin is referenced, guest on the program last year. This book also reminded me of C.O.W.S, a white woman admitted racist. She was on the program 2009, her book, Notes from No Man's Land. It reminded me because there's so many incidents in this book where white people are hanging black people from telephone poles. And that's what her book is all about, where she says she wanted to do a book about communication, and she started researching and going back to when they began putting up telephone poles, and she just kept seeing black person lynched from telephone pole, black person lynched from telephone pole, black person lynched from telephone pole. Same thing in this book. Pops up repeatedly. C.O.W.S.'s book, Notes from No Man's Land. And I'll say again, do not purchase books from white people. I don't know if I've been saying that enough. Go to the library. Do not purchase books from white people. I don't purchase any of these books. I ask them to send me a copy, or I go to the library, or I get a free copy that I can download off the internet. Really make an effort only to purchase books of non-white people, black people. Try to get it from a black bookstore if you can. Really want to watch how you spend your currency to make sure you are not supporting the system of white supremacy. We'll take a quick commercial break. I'm sorry for the person who dialed in. If we missed your call, try to wait it out a little bit to see if you were going to dial back in. I'll take a quick commercial break, and then anybody, if you have any thoughts that you want to share about the broadcast, down to hear it. I want to make sure I play a sound clip of Mr. Fuller. I remember he shared his views on the riots in Tulsa. He said the same thing, actually, that Mr. McWhirter said, that black people didn't talk about it. He said that his family and relatives and what have you, they did not talk about it. It was something that, was just kept real hush. You didn't want to bring it up. I'll play that sound clip because I think it's relevant, and then I will check the phone lines and what have you. Context of white supremacy. We will be right back. Quick commercial break. Give me a second while I'm pulling up the... switchboard is taking some time to load. While that's loading, I'll make sure I get in. We have a program tomorrow. Brother Polite, he'll be making his fourth visit. Context of white supremacy tomorrow evening. That would be Friday, October October 28th. Brother Polite, 4th visit. We also have a program Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. Neely Fuller Jr. will be here on Sunday. Dr. Kamal Kamban will be here on Monday. That should be the 500th broadcast of the cows. Saturday, Brother Khalifa will be here. You can visit his website, natturnertrails.com. There's no S on the end. natturnertrail.com. natturnertrail.com. He'll be here on Saturday. 500 broadcast, white people permitting, should be coming up on Monday. Okay, got my switchboard back. We'll get the commercial. We'll be right back. It'll be the commercial, and then I'll get the sound clip with Mr. Fuller on the Tulsa race riots. Context of white supremacy. We'll be right back.
RacismDaily.com, your number one source for global news reports on race, racism, and overt actions of white supremacy. From Asia to the Americas, to Europe, to Australia, to Africa, racism is not a thing of the past, it is our current reality. Be informed, be globally informed. You should be the first to know. RacismDaily.com, RacismDaily.com, RacismDaily.com.
Is racism hurting you? On issues of race, are you unable to speak, think, and act with clarity and confidence? Are you tired of laughing when nothing is funny, smiling when you are not happy, agreeing when you really disagree? At counterracism.com, you can learn specific strategies and techniques to counter the behaviors of the people who practice racism in all areas of activity, using words correctly, following counter-racist logic, even counter-racist science projects designed to reveal what racism is, how it works, and how to counter it. The open source code writing format allows you to pick and choose from a variety of counter-racist suggestions so you can produce the code that works for you. Stop by counterracism.com today and help replace racism with justice.
That's counter-racism.com.
Do you need a one-stop shop for all of your multimedia needs? Triumphant Multimedia is a skilled team of professionals with a passion for great marketing and chic design. Our specialties include consulting, brand development, copywriting, and creative graphic design that's second to none. We also offer photography, photo retouching, videography, and video editing. At Triumphant Multimedia, our goal is to provide highly effective creative solutions built to suit any individual need or budget. Give us a call at 678-732-8067 or check us out online at trimultimedia.com.
Hi everybody, welcome. This is Justice with the C.O.W.S Radio program. If you want to learn about, understand, and counter racism, white supremacy, be sure not to miss a C.O.W.S episode. We keep them jammed packed with constructive information to sharpen your use of words to help eliminate the system of racism, white supremacy, ASAP. Also, for more information on racism, white supremacy, and to invest in my counter-racist efforts, please visit my blog, justdojustice.blogspot.com. You're just saying just buckets and buckets of words.
Yo, this is Wade, one half of the Black Twins, and I want y'all to check something out. I latest project, Double Consciousness, the mixed message. This will be dropping October 2nd, 2011, featuring various audio from Umar Abdullah Johnson and Dr. Kambon, just to name a few. You can download this at www.gagmusicroom.bandcamp.com and at stlouismixtapes.com. That's STLmixtapes.com. Replace white supremacy with justice now.
This mixtape is only for victims of racism and supremacy.
Run a nice, clean town here. We don't have no problems at all. Everybody knows their place. All the local niggas know their place. I know you ain't no local nigga. You wouldn't be down here on the streets in Pryor, Oklahoma at night. We know you from somewhere else. We will politely tell you, you got no business. Didn't you see the sign on the outside of town? Well, get off of these streets, go somewhere and sleep in the bushes or wherever, because we ain't got no hotels for niggas around here. But don't show up around here again tonight or any other night, or we're going to whip you all the way to the jail. Do you understand me? If you see us and you run, we don't chase anybody. Now, that was another law. That was well understood by me and everybody else. I mean, this stuff like you see on cops, no. You take off running, he just reached back on that rack up there in that window. Because most of them had them, whatnot. Get that Winchester 73 and just get you in his sights and hit you right in the square of the back. I mean, no questions asked. You know, now what's the charge and what's not, what happened, what not? Nigga saw me coming, you know, and I said, hey, and he kept running. You don't run. You don't run from no white man unless he tell you to run. You gonna run? No, which means you up to something. And you disobeyed me when I signaled for you to pay attention to me. Are you crazy? Well, if you are, you're going to get sane, or you ain't going to have a chance to get sane, because the next thing you hear is going to be, I'm going to empty every gun I got. As far as I can see you. Hunting rifle or whatever. That's the way it worked. Clarence Barnett got hit right in the center of the back one night. Ran across a empty lot. Trying to remember that guy's name that shot him. I mean, he stood right there. I mean, and just took careful aim. It's like he's picking target practice, and did it casually. He had about a 6-inch 45 Frontier revolver. Fired one shot. Sent Clarence Barnett sliding. Ran. He ran. So he jumped out of the bushes and ran when he saw them coming. He was hiding in the bushes. They didn't say a word. Didn't tell him to halt or nothing. That's the procedure. Oh no. You gonna run? You know that maybe I want to talk to you and you're going to run. You run when I tell you to run. You walk when I tell you to walk. But you just jump up out of the bushes and run. As far as I'm concerned, you killed the King of England. I don't wait to find out what you are doing or where you're going or what you're scared of or even what you're running for. You stand your ground. I might want to talk to you. He was 17 years old. Our teachers had an assembly the next day in all colored schools and said, we don't want no trouble. So we all know what happened to Clarence last night. So we don't want no trouble from the white folks. That was our history teacher, Boston Russell. We had assembly. He let us know. Don't get, if you're a student, manual training and whatnot, don't get in trouble with the police. You bring the whole school into trouble. The whole black side of town into trouble. 60 miles away, they had the Tulsa riots. Years before I was born. But they never talked about them.
Never?
Slaughter. It was a slaughter. They never talked about it. The old folks never talked about it when I was in Oklahoma.
Wow.
I heard a rumor about it. I didn't know what to think.
Wow. What do you remember? Like what started it? What made all this come?
Yeah. A black teenager was on the elevator carrying a big box, and trying to carry the box, he stepped back and bumped up against a white woman. End of story. Riot is on. People formed at the, he was arrested. People formed at the jail. A few black people showed up. Somebody, everybody had guns, including black people back in those days in Oklahoma. Somebody fired a shot, and that was it. Stampede was on. Call out the National Guard, which is all white, and they added to it. Shooting every black person they saw. It wasn't a riot, it was a war. It wasn't like these riots we had in the 1960s where people run around knocking out windows and grabbing stuff, like they did in California a few years ago. None of that. No. It was people killing people.
How many people died?
Some estimates said around 300, 400, and some estimates are much lower. Because black people didn't know how to stay out of the way and whatnot, but the thing about it, nobody really knows because it wasn't accurately reported, because it wasn't supposed to be happening, but,
Do you think it's possible that 300 to 400 people could have been killed?
Sure. Killing a black person, you don't get no time for that. You don't even get called in court. Killing a black person is like killing a roach. And particularly when they call themselves going to be doing something like showing their muscle. That's why younger black people now, sometimes older black people are accused of being, too, Uncle Thomas or something like that, to the extent that they are. But it's justified, because, see, they know what will happen when white folks really get serious with black people, like, hey, we're sick of you. They know what will happen. See, younger black people go into shock. I mean, they can hurt you. In a way that black people don't, they're not even familiar with. I mean, they can be brutal. Black people think they know something about brutality. When white folks really get mad and say, hey, this is enough, when they just get tired of playing with us and decide they're just going to lower the boom, they know how to do it. That's why I say, hey, don't play with the race issue. You're playing with fire. It can get real ugly. Like all them riots of the 1960s and 70s and the Rodney King riots and all like that. That's stuff they let us do. We running up the street grinning and whatnot, and laughing. Shopping carts full of records and whatnot. Electronic stuff. They let us do that. They didn't do that out of fear. They say they'll do so much of it and then they'll quit, because By the time they burn up the neighborhood, I mean, they'll quit. They'll just make sure that it doesn't spread too far. That's the main thing they do. They figure that out real early. We'll just confine it to where they live. Because they can't build nothing up. After they get through tearing it up and burning it down, they'll be begging us to bring, come in there and bring some milk and food. They ain't got nothing.
I always wonder.
They'll cool off on their own, right? Let them burn down. Just let them burn down. I mean, the little raggedy places down there that they got anyway. I mean, hey, we're ready to gentrify it anyway.
I always wondered why black people didn't go to the white areas to riot.
Oh, yes. A few of them thought that they could do that. They immediately got killed. I mean, like in no time. Like one lady had showed it on television. A white lady was watering her lawn in Simi Valley. And she could see the smoke from South Central. So the reporter was asking her. This was on television. I was sitting right here looking at it. Said, well, what do you think about what's going over there in South Central and all like that? She said, I don't give a damn what they do. They can burn the houses down if they want to. Said, they're not going to come over here and bother me. And she was correct, because that had happened in every city, even during the Martin Luther King riots, including Washington. Right.
I saw during Hurricane Katrina, there were white people in New Orleans who made videos bragging about killing black males after the storm in Katrina. Like, they were on video bragging about killing black people.
Right. There ain't nothing to do. It's easy. Black people don't have no protection. I mean, we think we got some guns and whatnot, 9mm. A few of us got Tech-9s and all that. A few of us got machine guns. AK-47s and whatnot, a few. But I mean, when they unload their firepower, I mean, hey, shoot, they can shoot for days and days and days. Because they got unlimited firepower. And got access to it, got access to more. That's where we get ours. We ain't got no match for them and no riot. That's why I have it in my book. Don't participate in no riot. That's a losing proposition.
Context of white supremacy, I was thinking as the clip was playing, it would be more accurate as opposed to race riots. It would be more accurate as to what happened to just call it white terrorism, 1919, because it really was not. When people think of race riots and some black people running around, that's not what it was at all. This was white terrorism. I would have asked him that if I had thought about it earlier. Does he think that would have been a more accurate title as opposed to race riots? White terrorism, because that's what it was. At any rate, I will get Justice. She has a news article. I will share. These are just quick passages from the book. Read some of that I thought revealed information. That portion that he was talking about with the victim of white supremacy, Claude McKay, I did think that was interesting, where he's with his quote-unquote white friend. He writes, there had been bloody outbreak after outbreak in Omaha, Chicago, and Washington, and any crazy bomb might blow up in New York even. I walked over to a window and looked out on the backyard. Michael, white man, said, and if a riot broke out in Harlem and I got caught up here, I guess I'd be killed maybe. And if I were downtown and I was caught in it, said I, turning around. Michael said, and if there were trouble here like that in Chicago between colored and white, I on my side and you on yours, we might both be shooting at one another, eh? This is Claude McKay, black male. It was like that during the war that's just ended, I said. Brother against brother and friend against friend. They were all trapped in it and they were all helpless. I turned my back again and leaned out the window, thinking how in times of acute crisis, the finest individual thoughts and feelings may be reduced to nothing before the blind brute forces of tigerish tribalism which remain at the core of civilized society. The two men did not speak for months until shortly before McKay sailed for London. The black poet, at least for the time being, was sick of America. 263 of Red Summer. This is on 198, and this is in Omaha, when they had a White Terrorism erupted, and they killed, lynched a black male. 14-year-old Henry Fonda saw the lynching from the second floor of his father's printing shop across from the courthouse. His father felt it was important for his son to witness the savagery. Fonda recalled looking down on the mob, choking the courthouse square. Cursing, waving guns and clubs, Fonda saw Brown dragged from the jail by a group of armed men. A great huzzah went up when they saw the poor fellow, he recalled. They took him, strung him up to the end of a lamppost, and while his feet were still dancing in the air, they riddled his body with bullets. It was the most horrendous sight. Then they cut down the body, tied it to an auto, and dragged it through the streets of Omaha. Fonda's father did not say a word as they drove home. My hands were wet, and there were tears in my eyes, Fonda wrote later in his autobiography. All I could think of was that young black man dangling at the end of the lamppost, the shots and the revulsion I felt. Omaha's Black Weekly, The Monitor, reported mothers with babes in arms pushed forward to see the body. A few women fainted, but more shouted with glee. That's on 199, and the last portion, then we'll get Justice's news report. This is on page 70. This is in Mississippi, 1919. A grinning man in Laurel exhibited to a sidewalk crowd a quart jar filled with alcohol in which a finger cut jaggedly from a Negro's hand bobbed up and down. I got a finger, by God, the grinning man said, and I got some photographs, too. He passed them around, one showing John hanging from the tree, his bullet-riddled body naked except for a pair of olive drab army breeches. Another showed a smoldering pile of ashes beneath a dangling rope. These photos, the grinning man said, are 20 cents each. He sold out quickly. I bought some myself, as many as I could, and tore them up when I got out of sight. Ain't nobody can buy this finger, he announced proudly. I cut it off'n him myself. Gosh, but that nigger was tough. Tougher than the withers of a bull, by God. I like never to have sawed through it with a knife. But I did. He screamed like a woman when I done it. The yeller. He said it in expressive language. We ought to kill more of 'em round here, he amplified. Teach 'em a lesson. Only way I see to stop raping is to keep on lynching. I'm going to put this finger on exhibition in my store window tomorrow, boys, and I want you to drop around. He grinned again. And don't forget to bring the ladies. Page 71, Red Summer, Cameron McWhirter. Justice, if you have a news report to share or anything else you want to share with listeners, your line should be open.
Okay. I can hear myself in the background. Okay, it's gone now. But can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. This news article is from racismdaily.com. It was posted on October 26th of this year, 2011, and racism is still going on. The title is UK Ministry of Justice. Black and Asian rioters disproportionately involved in disturbances. Black and Asian rioters were disproportionately involved in the summer's disturbances, figures revealed yesterday. More than half of those charged with offenses were from a black or ethnic minority background, whatever that means, compared with 42% who were white, the Ministry of Justice figures showed. In some areas of the country, the proportion of black rioters were more than 5 times the local population. I don't know if that's true or not. In the most detailed breakdown yet of the disturbances, it also emerged that more than a third of youngsters involved had been excluded from school in the previous year. 1 in 3 adults were claiming unemployment benefits, compared with a 12% national average, and 160 rioters were in a receipt of disability or incapacity allowances. The scale of offending was also revealed for the first time, as figures showed more than 2,500 shops and businesses were targeted, and 1 in 8 crimes were street muggings or other offenses against individuals. However, fears that gangs had spearheaded the disturbances were dismissed, as the analysis showed only 13% of offenders belonged to one. In terms of ethnicity, 46% of those appearing in court were from black or mixed black backgrounds. 42% were white and 7% were Asian. You can read the rest on racismdaily.com. The title again is UK Ministry of Justice, Black and Asian rioters disproportionately involved in disturbances. And and that's the end of the article.
Well, any thoughts on the report?
No. Yeah. Well, okay, yeah. I have one thought. It says on the article, in some areas of the country, the proportion of black rioters were more than 5 times the local population. Now, like I said, that might be true, that might not be true, but yeah. Because I suspect that, the most mistreating people on the planet is white people, racist man, and racist woman. So yeah, I don't know if that's true or not.
Yeah, if they're counting, I'm just looking at the second paragraph in the report. The way that they came up with this figure is based on looking at the people who were charged with an offense. That right there is very significant, because I suspect non-white people probably were disproportionately arrested, disproportionately charged, and disproportionately convicted, because that's true in this area of the world, I know, and white people have statistics to back that. That does not mean that they were disproportionately involved in the quote-unquote rioting. What they're doing is just looking at the statistics for who was charged, and I strongly suspect that racism, white supremacy was a huge factor with regards to who got charged, who got arrested, and who did not. I could be incorrect, but yeah, that's just my thoughts on how they compiled those statistics. Do you have anything else you want to share with listeners, Justice?
Okay, well, I'll show this later, but, no.
Alrighty. I don't have a news report, but I did see other folks on the line. I'll check to see if they had any thoughts or comments that they wanted to share about the program. I'll just say before I check the phone lines, if you dialed in free HD line, it's *6. If you're on the TalkShoe line, it's *8. That report about Emmett Till, I think that's common knowledge. The more that I'm thinking about it, Mr. McWhirter, he wrote that book. He's a reporter with the Wall Street Journal. I find it hard to believe that he wouldn't be familiar with Emmett Till and the white perpetrators in that case, giving an interview where they were compensated thousands of dollars to give that interview with Look magazine at the time, where they confessed to the crime. I'm a pretty feeble-minded victim of white supremacy, and I was very aware that it was a confession. They weren't trying to be tongue-in-cheek about what they did. They bragged about it. They were proud of lynching, castrating a 14-year-old black male. And there's video footage. It's not just a written interview, which I'm sure you can read, but there's also video footage of them talking about this after the trial, and they're all smiles. Happy to do it. Best time of our life, going out and chopping up that 14-year-old black male. I just find that very suspicious, especially since he works with the Wall Street Journal. We're talking about someone who I would think is pretty informed, even though, his book is not about that particular time period. That is suspicious in my book, but you can investigate that. They did confess. It's even a part of PBS's Eyes on the Prize series, where they talk about the post-trial antics of the white racists who were involved in that crime against Emmett Till. Mississippi, again, unique plantation under racism, white supremacy, the state known as Mississippi. Any of the folks that are on the line, if you had questions or comments, the people that called with a question, I think that's 909, and the person who dialed in 8753, your lines are open. If there's anybody else who had a question or comment, you know what to do to get your hand up, 909, or the person that called in 8753. Did you all have questions or comments?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. This program, it was a excellent program. These kind of programs I really like, because it just, my mind, it gets me to thinking, and I just, was remembering, when he was talking about the one black male that was basically running for his life and, trying to make it home from work. I just thought of, I've been in like 2 occasions where I was running for my life, and one time it was, I was afraid. Like I was younger and I was afraid. I just remember being terrified. And the other time, I was tired. I ran and maybe a block, and I just was exhausted. And I was telling my friend, I was like, man, I'm tired. You know what I'm saying? I'm tired. He was like, you better run. He was like, come on. You know what I'm saying? He was like, come on. This is no time to be tired. It's like the alternative is, the alternative is, like, he basically was saying, like, that's, you saying that you're tired is absurd. You know what I'm saying? At this moment, like, whatever, man, like, die trying, you know what I'm saying? And it just reminded me of, when I was hearing about the black male running home, that don't think for a second that this cannot happen again. Not for 1 second. And, you know, I worked out today, you know, I'm a little tired or whatever, and I mean, I just was thinking that if the people in that town, you know, were thinking that, you know, we're completely vulnerable, you might have to run for your life. I mean, it just brings up a lot of things, like that feeling of terror that I had. I don't want that. I mean, I've been in some situations, I've been in some situations where it's like I don't think I will ever feel that terror again, because of this, you know, because I just don't think I'll ever feel that again. I've thought about it. I've analyzed things, and I just decided that I would never feel that way again. And as far as me being exhausted, like I was, I don't know if I'll I don't know. I'm not totally positive. As I'm positive, I wouldn't feel terrified. But I'm working on my cardio. Believe that. You know what I'm saying? So I just think that don't think that this cannot happen. And like I said, the people in that town, just think if they were thinking that, you know, preparing or anything. There's so much I think this book will offer as far as just recognizing patterns and knowing that this could happen again. You might need your cardio. I mean, you might need to, you know, save your life. Just things like that. So, you know, I appreciate shows like this because it gets me to thinking. You know, like it's just like a tune-up. It's like a tune-up, man. I mean, somehow it's just when you hear things like this, it's just like reality right in your face. So.
I'll save a comment. The person that dialed in 5591, your line is open as well. All three of your lines are open. 5591, your line is open. Did you have a question or comment?
Yes, I had a question and some comments. I guess I'll start with the Occupy Wall Street. After the incidents and the various arrests and things like that with the police just going on around the world, why are black people and people in general so surprised about martial law? Like, we're seeing, you know, the guards coming to occupy towns and things like that, but people seem so surprised that it's happening today. Why do you feel that is?
I'm not. I'll just get that in. I'm not. I think Mr. Fuller said you should be prepared. If the moon should fall in the Pacific Ocean, you should not be surprised. We're under racism, white supremacy. I would not be surprised if, you know, racist man and racist woman decided to roll 8 tanks down the road right now. That's racism, white supremacy.
Because I have a friend that basically thinks, you know, this is the time. This is what's going to change things. And I don't want to be real negative about it, but I don't feel this is it. I don't really feel the change about to come from the Occupy Wall Street, other than, you know, more unlawful arrests and things like that. There's more people seeing how the system really is, how it has been for black people for forever, for my whole existence. You know, me being 25 and things like that, I haven't seen much of a change, even with Obama. And so I don't know what the issue is. Is this the movement? Is this the movement that's supposed to happen in our generation, as my friend calls it? The 99%.
We're supposed to be talking about that for Saturday. I think that's confusion. I think all of that is camouflage. And Dr. Umar Abdullah Johnson, he was talking about that on Tuesday. He was saying that he suspects that 2012 white people are going to fabricate social disorder so that there'll be a reason to go after black people. And I think not only the Occupy Wall Street, I think it could possibly confuse a lot of black people into thinking that, you know, there are young white people who are against the system, down with racism, who, you know, want to see everybody in just system. I think it will create confusion, and it could induce black people and non-white people to getting involved with that. And then the white people can pull out, and then it'll be exactly that fabricated social disorder, and then it'll be, bam, we're tired of these non-white people out here camping and, you know, doing whatever they're doing. Let's go get them. Like, I think it could dovetail nicely with what I think is going to happen, where they make excuses to go after non-white people, especially black people in this area of the world.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, because you can also see people putting up the 1% signs now, like they're talking about they being, you know, having all this wealth. Like I seen a girl that had a picture that said, I inherited such and such amount of money when she turned 18 or whatever, and she is the 1%, showing how she cares about what's going on and things like that. But as you say, when all this is over, she's still going to have that money to fall back on. Like, yeah, she can go put her neck out there, maybe get arrested, but she has that money and those resources to get herself out of that situation.
Mm-hmm.
And my other, I guess, question was, I've been missing some of the shows. I've been trying to log on to Talk Show to try to, you know, start programming I program the shows into my phone so I don't miss them, and I haven't been updated on, you know, what shows are coming up. So I want to see what'll be coming up to, you know, within the next week.
I just added programs today. So that might be a part of it. There'll be a broadcast tomorrow, 9 p.m. Eastern, Friday evening. Brother Polite, he'll be on the program. Saturday, there'll be a program at 3 p.m. Eastern. Brother Khalifa, his website is natturnertrail.com. Black male. He's participating in attempting to get reparations for black people in this area of the world. He also has been analyzing the Occupy Wall Street, I guess, the events associated with that. He has a slightly different take on it, but it'll be good to discuss, hear his thoughts. Sunday, Neely Fuller Jr. will be on. That's at 7 p.m. Eastern. And Monday, Dr. Kamal Kamban, he'll be on 7 p.m. Eastern as well. That's the next, I guess, 4 days.
Yeah, that sounds like a great lineup. Thank you.
Sure. All of your lines are still open. Person who called in on the Talk Shoe line from Texas, did you have a question and comment?
No. Can I be heard? That was me? No.
That was a different person. We can still hear you, the person who just asked your question. I think the person from Texas on Talk Shoe, your line is open as well, and we can hear you too, sir.
Yes, greetings. I was listening to this show, and it got me thinking, because since I started listening to your show last spring, actually, I started listening to the cows, and I built up quite a library and started reading, and I have Elliot Jackson's book and several others. I have The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, read that one, Urugu. And the more I read into it, and the more I see how things are today, it feels chills up my spine. Because black people in America are like lambs getting ready for slaughter. We really don't understand the barbaric nature of white folk. I think it's perfect because they took over the school system, and they've gotten us believing that they're the most peace-loving people on planet Earth, and, you know, black people, what is your problem? And our grandparents don't talk about it because they experience straight terrorism. And when I try to have conversations with both sets of my grandparents, it inevitably ends up back into church and Jesus. So black people have not really, en masse, been able to call their grandparents for an understanding of the barbaric nature of white folks. Plus, most of our grandparents have bought into the integration myth. So black people, young black people, and when you add on the fact that we don't read much, and the media is polar opposite from what reality is. We have to really educate ourselves and prepare ourselves because, as 909 said, we have to get our cardio game up, and we have to get our understanding of who we are really dealing with. And what I like about your show is that you take a worldwide perspective, and it shows that if you have an appreciable amount of melanin, these white people ain't playing with us anywhere on this planet. And I just want to say I appreciate you for the show, and it's given me another book to read. So I just wanted to comment on that. Thanks.
Thank you for calling in. I'm glad that is music to my ears. Very constructive to hear. It motivated some black people to investigate and do some research about racism, white supremacy, and to read Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. And Yurugu, man, that is one of the best books. I think that book, more than any other book, is directly responsible for me doing this program. And I think I can say that hands down. Yurugu by Dr. Marimba Ani, hands down, that book above anybody else's book is most responsible for me doing this program. I was extremely confused until I read her book. I was trying to make excuses for white people and say it was everything. The problem is any and everything, any and everyone but white people. And reading that book, it was the smack in the face I needed. No, the problem is white people worldwide. That's what it has been. That's what it is. The problem is white people. Yurugu, Dr. Marimba Ani, definite read for any black person in the universe.
Gus, would you mind spelling that, please?
Yurugu is Y-U-R-U-G-U. Yurugu, and the author is Dr. Marimba Ani. She's a black female. Marimba, M-A-R-I-M-B-A, and her last name is Ani, A-N-I. Dr. Marimba Ani, Yurugu. It's in paperback, hardback. It came out in the early 1990s. She references Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, Neely Fuller Jr. Very thorough, very thorough. It is that 909, I think, reading comprehension, it is not an easy read. At least I'll say that. For me, it's not one of those easy reads. She's very informed. She's had a lot of education. I suspect a lot more education than most black people in this area of the world. It's not written at a 10th grade reading level, so it's one of those you kind of have to take your time and read. I think if you are familiar with more of the sources that she quotes, like if you've already read the ISIS papers, Mr. Fuller, Iceman Inheritance, she quotes a lot of people. The more familiar you are with those works, the more your reading comprehension will skyrocket if you read that book.
And it took me several months to get through Yurugu, but once I was done, I had a clear understanding of how they are, and basically it gave me the psychological space I needed to really put things into perspective. It really ends a lot of our confusion. That one work, if I can say, it can really work to end a lot of confusion just by reading that.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Gus, I wanted to say, everybody, the comments were good comments. Everybody's, what I've heard, yeah, definitely. I was just thinking, when I was tired, when I was, running and it seemed life-threatening, I wasn't thinking. And when I was terrified, I wasn't thinking. Like, I wasn't thinking of, creating a weapon. I wasn't thinking of the things that, like, now what I would, like, how I would think. It's like I wasn't thinking the way I should have been thinking at the time. And that's one thing I just remember, terrified and just being tired, and I wasn't thinking. And it's a trip because like even talking about it sometimes I don't really talk about it, but just I don't that memory, and I think that's why the elders didn't really want to recall it, because they didn't work through that terror. So as soon as they start talking about it or thinking about it, they just get terrified all over again. It's like, you know, so that's why they didn't talk about it, because, you know, like they didn't work through it. You know, they didn't. So, yeah, man, I had to it was like I had to go through therapy, because, you know, when people go to war, I guess, and certain events happen, trauma, you just, you know, you're traumatized by it. And if you don't do the work, you don't really get over that kind of stuff. So, it could be a great lesson. It was a lesson for me, just knowing that I had to do much better, because I didn't want to be in that position again, just as vulnerable as I was. And I think white people in that situation, if you're terrified, if you're just terrified, I mean, that's what they want, because you're not thinking really, you know, how to fight back. I mean, like survival, you know, kicking in strong, you know. So this program just made me think about a lot of things, and I just think that people, hopefully, that if somebody would read it and put themselves in the shoes of those ancestors, and think of things that maybe they could have done, or, you know, just because if you don't know the history, you know, you can repeat that can happen again, and we'll be in the same position, just you know, not knowing what to do, you know. So I just wanted to say that. That's why I brought up the fact that, you know, I was terrified and didn't want to be terrified again, because I wasn't thinking. That was the point of that.
I'm going to mute my line, so other people, if you want to hop in, feel free. I just wanted to throw in, I wrote that on Facebook when I was promoting the program, that this is one part of our history we do not want to repeat, and I for sure see it on the horizon. Man, I got to get that in. I almost said it. The only reason I didn't is because I thought the program with Dr. Umar Abdullah Johnson was it was great. I thought he had so much great information. When he ended the program saying there are black people who have suspicious backgrounds, that socially fabricated disorder to make an excuse to come after black people, irritated Genie being unemployed for Homeland, and man, I was almost dancing around. Not dancing in terms of happy, but it was like, man, that is extraordinarily dangerous for what I'm seeing, and exactly what he said. Now, I mean, he asked him about it when he was on the program in May, and he gave his thoughts. That's fine. In my view, somebody coming out with the views that he takes on things, saying that we need to, you know, be in cells to go after people, or we need to go and do violence against gay black people or whomever, that is extremely suspicious under these conditions, with him being employed at Homeland Security, which he admitted. Just make sure I have that on the record. Now, just the quick comment I wanted to make, if this does unfortunately repeat, I would hate to see black people having to flee or being chased out, or at gunpoint being marched out of a city, and us not being able to run or escape efficiently because we got our jumbo television flat screen. We don't want to let that go. That is a real sad picture that I would not want to see. I hope we can do better, and maybe this will help us become unglued to some of our personal items. I'll mute my line.
Yeah, it's not going to be the black male rape the white female. Man, you know that ain't going to fly. I mean, white females is everywhere. Everybody's tossing them up. So it's going to be a black group killing a white. That's what it's going to be. It's going to be black people killing a group of white people, a family or something. It ain't going to be no rape. It's going to be some blacks got together, killed some white people. And it can be fabricated, whatever. You already see that it don't even have to be true. But once you set the climate, that's what they doing right now. They chopping the wood, they setting it out to dry. They setting us up for the like the caller said. They setting us up for the slaughter. And homeboy was talking about the tinder. They chopping the wood. They setting it out to dry. They getting it nice and ready. So when that fire hit it, man, it's flame on. So yeah, man, that's suspicious, because that's what it's gonna be. It's gonna be a terrorist cell, so-called black terrorist cell, and you see it. You see it with these inflammatory, so-called black militants or whatever, with their guns and stuff like that. And it's time to kill white people and stuff like that, man. Man, I mean, I was happy to hear Umar saying what he was saying, because I'm like, because he's in that so-called conscious community. So I'm like, man, I hope you telling them that. Because they talking real foolish, you know what I mean, as far as they're setting themselves. I mean, you listen to them talk, the things that they say ain't gonna do nothing but get a bunch of black people killed. So and they really like Umar, they respect him, I guess, and whatnot. So yeah, I hope he's telling them that, because that ain't gonna do it. Not no group of cells and all that stuff. You feel what I'm saying? It's like, I was thinking about the ancestors and what could they have done to protect themselves, from that slaughter that came through. I mean, they were farmers, they were working, with tools and stuff like that. But in a situation like that, if they would have tried to organize some type of real military force, one of them black people that was in the group, they would have went and told the white people, they over there talking about killing y'all, they would have killed him, and then went and killed the messenger, and then went and started putting their work. So, I mean, they couldn't exactly just posse up, but I just feel like, I'm just thinking, like, what could they have done? And I think that the only thing they could have done is prepared independently, you know what I'm saying, like the United Independent. You prepare yourself. And when people start seeing you, like, the cardio and stuff like that, seeing you run and stuff like that, man, it's a trip. Like, people see you run and they want to run. It's like they need to see a black person run. And then it's like, oh, now they have permission to do it. When they see you strong and they see you run and they see you, correcting your speech, trying to be as polite as possible and stuff like that, they pick that stuff up quick. So I think that's something that maybe they could have done if it would have been one. If it would have been a black person there that would have been thinking on that tip, like, not me, like, white people try to get at me like that, I'm gonna be a hard kill, I mean, possibly, it could go bad, but I think a lot more, maybe a lot more black people would have kind of said, yeah, we need to be strong too. We need to sharpen up our tools, because if you farming, you got all that metal there. You could be sharpening that stuff up. Like, I do a lot of things, man. I don't know if I want to say on the line, but it's just like, there's a lot of stuff around you that's deadly, man. If you just practice using it, anything could be a deadly weapon. So that's something I think, like, United Independent, man. It's like, so yeah, you'll influence a lot of people doing your cardio and your strength training and your mental game, and knowing your neighborhood, or just knowing maps and stuff like that, environment, getting out in different environments and things, because they can use somebody like Homeland Security. That's what that's what they're gonna do. They just setting it up right now. That's what's gonna happen. I'm sorry to say. I mean, I hope it don't and all this stuff, but hope is nothing, man. That's just a fact. It's like everything I'm observing, just like the caller was saying. Everything I'm observing right now is like they just setting us up, man. They just setting us up. So. I just want to say that.
I don't know about you guys, but every time I brought the subject of racism up to white people, I don't care if it's in person or on a message board, but they always steer you in the direction of the best way to solve racism is to stop talking about it. And for black folks, that is dangerous. Okay? And a lot of us buy into that.
I mean, he kept saying, "Oh, it's not like it used to be. Oh, it's." I mean, that's dangerous right there. Like, I mean, come on, man. I mean, what you trying to do? You know what I mean? It can't happen again. Oh, it's a different time. But man, just because they not, just because it's not, we not hanging from telephone poles and whatnot. I mean, that message right there. Like, man, keep that to yourself, man. You know what I'm saying? Black people don't need to be hearing that. It's not, it'll never happen again. So, I mean, but and him not saying it's a global, when Gus gave the definition, I didn't really hear that part, but I guess I gathered from what they were saying that he didn't agree with Gus's definition of racism, white supremacy. White people always do that. That's like their defense mechanism, and that's the racism right there. They always going to come with that foolishness, and the foolishness is just to keep you vulnerable, keep you not thinking, truthfully that this situation is life threatening. You need to be thinking on a military. You need to be on your military footing. They always going to say that. No matter what the evidence shows. I mean, you just wrote this book basically saying that it don't take much for white people to just go nuts and kill up a bunch of black people, and then and then your advice to black people, oh, well, it's not the same time, it's a different time. Man, they're gonna always do that. That's just a part of their survival. And I've been reading some stuff, man, from independent sources, man, that basically says that Dr. Wilson is 100% right. I mean, these are scientists, man, like par excellence, man, saying that the survival thing is violence, and that this is what this system is. This global system of racism, white supremacy is a survival. Is based on survival. These are independent studies that's saying that she is absolutely right. That this violence and all that's going to happen is based on this, that they want that survival.
I saw someone on the talk show. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just saying it was someone on the talk show line. I saw they had a hand up, but then it went back down. If you have a question or comment, it's *8 if you're on the talk show line, and I can open your line up. I'll mute myself. I'll make sure I get my comment. If nobody else has anything they wanted to share. In terms of patterns and what you just said about it happening again, and I think he admitted what happened during Hurricane Katrina. It's exactly what he wrote about. I think he said that white people, be very clear, white people, racist terrorists coming into the state, didn't even live in New Orleans, coming in from all over, just looking for an opportunity to kill black people. And you can, any way you want to research that. This is 2005, not 1919. This is 2005. And I should have remembered Cynthia McKinney when she came out, she was on the program in December of 2010 and talked about her report that she got information that 5,000 black people in greater confinement prison during Katrina were executed. And I think you just heard Dr. Leonard Moore. He said nobody will ever even know the scope of what happened and the damage that white people inflicted on black people during Hurricane Katrina. He said you're probably just getting the tip of the iceberg. I think Dr. Moore, he said he talked to enforcement officers, black enforcement officers, who said the same thing that you all are saying your relatives, older relatives are saying. I don't even want to talk about what I saw during Hurricane Katrina. Don't even want to talk about it. I think he said, some of them said, I will take what I saw to my grave. That's 2005, and saying that can't happen again. That could happen right now. I'm just saying, I think they got plans for this to happen on a massive scale in this area of the world to black people especially. And just looking patterns, things that he mentioned in 1919, I said about the economy, and he said hyperinflation. You see that now. People not having jobs. You see that now. White people, things that you didn't see. Well, I guess it is the same thing. He was saying white people complaining about black people being super uppity. You see that now. That's all over the place with President Obama, and I think it's going to be more of that, even with the strike with the NBA. You got these uppity niggers who are making too much money anyway, LeBron James and the rest of them. You're going to see more of that. I suspect that racial showcasing, particularly I think if the 2012 presidential election ends up being Herman Cain and President Obama, man, you talk about kindling for the fire. White people are going to be, I mean, gosh, you are going to see David Duke type white people coming out of the woodwork. If it ends up, and I don't know if it will be, we got a ways to go, but if it ends up being Herman Cain and President Obama for the White House, the racism that you saw in the 2008 campaign is going to magnify exponentially, in my opinion, if that's what it ends up being. And I think that is a racist plan to motivate the pieces that I read from his book, where a white man, he sold his house to a black person to upset some other white people. They know this. He has tons of anecdotes in his book where white people would use black people to break strikes because they knew that was going to upset the white people. And I'm arguing that they're going to do the same thing now, set up black people and make it look like black people are the cause of all of the problems that are happening with the economy and everything else. A non-white person in the White House, they're going to set that stage so that white people will be motivated to get out and practice racism in a real, explicit, vulgar, and violent manner. And you just tie that in with their population concerns about their own fertility rates and the rising tide of non-white people, you have a recipe for exactly what Dr. Umar Johnson said on the program, what you all are saying, what I'm saying. You should be extremely suspicious, be paying attention, be on wartime footing. I assert white people are not joking. It's about to get way worse. That economy continues to get bad. You're going to see white people not doing that foolishness to occupy Wall Street. It's going to be let's occupy the hood for real. Let's get these niggas in check.
Yeah, this should really motivate us because, you know, our ancestors were hung. Our ancestors were caught. I mean, just how they describe talking about he's a coward. I mean, how was the ancestor a coward for? I mean, screaming or whatever. I mean, he was in pain. He was scared. You know what I'm saying? And the white person had the nerve to call him a coward. You know what I'm saying? But they posse up and do all this stuff. But yeah, this should motivate us because I was just thinking, you know. Yeah, that's what the ancestors went through, man. I mean, they went. Look at what happened to them, man. And I mean, I don't know, man. I mean, if I was one of those like if there's a such thing as reincarnation, and I was back then, I mean, you want to go through that again? You want to get killed? You want to be, you know? You got to keep coming back, getting killed. You know what I mean? Horribly by white people. That's just that's your merry-go-round that you keep. That keep happening to you. I mean, it should motivate you to be. You know, like this ain't happening again. Not like this. I mean, it just should motivate you to get your act together. Get it together, man. You know, if you see that this is what's happening, you know, I think that's what the benefit of this book, and should motivate us not to want to go through that again. Like I said, I don't know about the reincarnation thing, but I really when I read stuff like that, man, I swear I'll be feeling. I mean, I'm not saying that I was, but I feel it. I know you got to put flesh and blood on that, man. Them was our ancestors, man. They were human beings, flesh and blood. They had a heart. They had feelings. You know what I mean? They felt pain. And these white people, what did he say? He said they hoisted them up like a meat to slaughter or something like that. I mean, that's a person. They you know, the white people are crazy, man. I mean, they psychotic. They like to rip people apart and pull on them and tear them, tear you know, the scrotum and all this other stuff that they like to do once they get a hold of you, grabbing all on you, pulling you and everything, pull your hair out, cut your ear off or whatever, cut your lips off, everything that they talk about. Us being monkeys and stuff like that, big lips, big nose, and they like to cut that stuff, man. So, and you want to watch, you know, I don't know what the latest programs and stuff, BET and stuff like that, PlayStation. I mean, man, it's just, oh man. I mean, you know, and then he said that most black people that he run into, they say, well, why don't we know about this? Why don't we know about this? I mean, this kind of stuff, I mean, I don't know. It's a reason why we don't know about that kind of stuff. First of all, the ancestors didn't talk about it. Second of all, white people ain't finna just, you know, teach this in high school, junior high. This is what happened, because it's gonna rise your spirit. It's gonna make your spirit. It's gonna raise your spirit. Guaranteed. This kind of stuff like this material raises your spirit. It does. So they don't want us to know this kind of stuff. This stuff should be on our lips every day. This stuff should be remembered every day. Somebody was asking, like, why they don't let Martin Luther King die? They always honoring him. It's always they want us. They try to put us. Martin Luther King, he got to be there. All this other stuff, like the show you did about the black male that you know was killing white people and stuff like that. Yeah, they don't want you thinking about him. They want you to think about the integrationists, you know, and whatnot, and not even his last speeches, because you know his last speeches was very radical. You know, he wasn't playing it. I mean, he sounded like, you know, Malcolm X at the end. You know, so they don't talk about that Martin Luther King. They just so yeah, that's why they keep rehashing this fake Martin Luther King. But yeah, I hope people this Gus, man, if this book doesn't, if this don't motivate for black people, man, and really just on an individual tip, man, to you must want to die a horrible death, man, because I don't see nothing else. You might end up dying a horrible death anyway, but I mean, you just really just putting your neck out there, man. I mean, that's crazy. But if you psychologically messed up, maybe it's a suicide type of thing. Like you don't care. You think you don't care, but when they ripping you apart and you feeling intense pain, I bet you're gonna wish you done something. But they got us kind of numb, also. So I recognize that.
A person dialed in with a hand up on the talk shoe line. I'm going to get your hand. I just wanted to share another passage from this book. This is why I have white people on. It's not because I don't think this guy's a racist. Not at all. I've already told you the conclusion on that. It's just white people know. They know how they get down. They have this information. Constructive information. And this was Black, a suggestion. I didn't even know about this book. It just came out a couple weeks ago. He saw Mr. McWhirter on Book TV, and he sent me the link to check it out, and I thought it was very constructive information. I'm glad I got it. The book, extremely constructive. The person on Talk Sheet with a Hand, I'm going to get your hand. I just want to read this passage. I read a portion of it earlier, but I just want to add another chunk just so that you can understand. You know, I believe this could happen again, like 2012. In fact, I believe white people are creating an environment for this to happen again. This is on 130. Tommy Doyle said the niggers were never going to forget the month of July 1919. Studs said that they ought to hang every nigger in the city to telephone poles and let them swing there in the breeze. Benny Tate said that for every white man killed in the riots, 10 black apes ought to be massacred. In the novel, the only black person the gang finds is a 10-year-old boy. They take his clothes off and burn them, then burn his feet and bottom with matches. They beat him and urinate on him, and then let him run away. This fictional account echoed reality. From 9 o'clock Sunday night until 3 Monday morning, at least 27 blacks were beaten, 7 were stabbed, and 4 were shot. Chicago's South Side white gangs were on a rampage. And for how much things have changed, I think Chicago's South Side is still widely acknowledged by white people and non-white people, one of the most segregated areas in this area of the world, for how much change there has been. The person on Talk Sheet with a hand up, your line is open. Person on Talk Sheet with a hand up, did you have a question or comment? Not hearing you, M1. Not sure if you're if you hit your mute button or something is happening on your end. It's showing that your line is open.
Oh, how's that?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah. I too believe that the reason that this information is hidden from us, like the caller said, that we don't get angry, that we don't formulate some kind of way in order to combat this. And generally, also it's to basically make white people look good. Now, like I said, when you mention these things, you unfortunately had our ancestors say, "I'm going to take this to the grave." But then you have white people that will say that was in the past, let's move on. But do you not, to this day, still hear Remember the Alamo? And that was, 165 years ago? White people still say Remember the Alamo because Davy Crockett was killed. Jim Bowie was killed. And their relatives, so you gotta remember when they get killed. If something bad happens to them, but when it's you, you're supposed to move on, and that's the last thing we should do. And I'm sorry, I missed the program on Mark Essex. Yeah, because that's the name I was familiar with, but a lot of other people wasn't. I do remember reading how he was subjected to, when he had his confrontation with the police, that he was subjected to more police fire than any other quote-unquote random shooter or active shooter. That again includes racism, white supremacy. I mean, I read that police fired a full solid 2 minutes. Now, that's a lot of ammo. You know anything about that? Yeah, as I always say, just remember everything. Let's not forget what happened to us.
Well, I was going to say, young people, I mean, if you teenagers, let them know, because when they hear this kind of stuff, I talk to them all the time, and I'm around them every day. So when I tell them, you know, this is all I talk about. I mean, I'm always bringing up the ancestors and what we went through. We came over here as, we were our ancestors were enslaved, and slavery wasn't no banjo, type of. They wasn't singing and dancing. You feel what I'm saying? They were being murdered every day, beat. So when they hear that, and then just knowing that, they're alive because, their ancestors, procreated and, on down the line. But that you don't want to dishonor that what they went through, because that was hell, and we still in hell. And everything that they try to do, I try to explain to them that with this gang banging and all that stuff, you're just trying to forget all that trauma. You're trying to forget about slavery. Anything to occupy your mind, the enemy has set this stuff up to occupy your mind, so you don't remember. You know what I'm saying? You don't hear the ancestors' voice, if you will. Like, I mean, they were, that's flesh and blood, man. That really happened. I mean, their blood is man. So anyway, they really get fired up when they hear that. They get fired up. They just like, man, this is some. I'm a puppet. You feel me? I'm a marionette. I'm a puppet. Like, I'm being jerked around. Why ain't nobody tell me this? But and man, just that seed right there. I like it. I like seeing it. I like planting those seeds. I'm always doing it, and because I know it happened to me when I was out there doing crazy stuff. I'm in police chases and all this other crazy stuff, man. And when somebody sat down and told me, and I started reading and whatnot, man, it changed my life, because I knew that I wasn't I wasn't acting on my own. So it's I think, the young. I'm not that old or anything, but I know that for the older, you should just tell the youth, tell the teenagers and whatnot, and that'll invigorate you. Once you see them, getting in, trying to understand and really waking up, it'll invigorate you. Like the older people, 30s and 40s or whatever, they just sleep. They don't have no energy, and it's because they don't talk to the youth. If you just talk to them and tell them like whatever information that you know, it'll invigorate you, because they're gonna want to know more. They're gonna keep asking you questions. That ain't no problem, so long as you. As long as you're willing to talk to them and answer to the best of your knowledge, and it'll be a back and forth. It'll invigorate you, I think. I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty confident that that's how it works. So.
I would agree. See if we go 5 minutes. If anybody has anything else they want to share before we get ready to wrap up, we did our extra session. Hope it was constructive for folks. So you gave some other people an opportunity to dial in. Yurugu, the full title, is an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior. Again, it's by Dr. Marimba Ani. Yurugu, an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior. Outstanding work. I mean, man, I would highly recommend. And again, just to make sure I emphasize, this is about a 600-page book. It's about, I think, 550, and that's not including notes or bibliography, anything. I mean, 550 pages that you have to read to finish the book. But it's worth it. It's worth every word, every page. Phenomenal information. Just take your time, read it slow. You don't have to finish it in a week. Just read whatever pace you go at. Take your time, read it. Man, you will benefit. If you're a black person anywhere under racism, white supremacy in the universe, you will benefit from reading Yurugu. And Josh Wickett, he did a counter-racist film review of this book. That's how I found out about it in the first place. You can read the book review on thecode.net. Thecode.net. Go there and just look for the book review section and click Yurugu. I should be a picture of the book, and he breaks down what he learned from the book, some of the main points. Great way to start, kind of get your appetite wet for what to expect. I'll mute my line, 5 minutes. If you all need anything to think about, we'll be back. If you want a little more time to think, get your thoughts together, we'll be back tomorrow. That's Friday, October 28th. Brother Polite, his fourth visit, he'll be talking about ways that black people can try to get some coins in their pocket. Always good to have him on the program. He's preparing for a lecture on November 6th. So he'll be here tomorrow, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. Brother Polite returns to the cows. Again, looking forward to Mr. Fuller this weekend, as well as Dr. Kamal Kamban on Monday, October 31st. With that, I'll mute my line. We'll do 5 minutes if anybody has anything they want to share before we get ready to wrap up.
Yes, very quickly. When you had Dr. Chinwezu on, I went and looked for his books, and what I found is they are very expensive if you go the conventional route of Amazon.com or they're invisible at Barnes & Noble, but I found an African bookstore online, and with the guy, what you do is you look up the book you want and you call them. And when I called the salesman, he told me that a lot of African books, a lot of books by African scholars, both in America and abroad, the Europeans they minimize the amount that are available in order to make them appear out of print. And so the bookstore is AfricanWorldBooks.com, and it's African with a K. And you can find literally every title that you've heard of and thousands more that you haven't. It's very, very extensive. And I've been buying from them since I've been listening to this show, especially since you had Dr. Chinwezu on and I needed his works. And I was able to procure all of them from that place. So I thought that would be helpful because the war is on information, and they make every effort they can to minimize our access to it and to distract us from even looking to go search for it. So I'll definitely be talking more to the youth about what I've been discovering, because what I found was when I first started reading, you go through a phase where you're just very angry. You're angry because you never heard of it. You're angry because white people are in your face every day, and they're pretending to be calm and innocent and so devoid of violence. But they have words in their language like collateral damage, but they would justify the massacre of millions to get at one person. And from the cultures that I've studied and the languages that I know, you don't have that worldview in those other the majority melanated people's language. There's no justification for killing thousands of people to kill one. But in a European mind, it is. I sound like I'm rambling here, but there's just so much that I've only recently come to know, and I think back on how confused I was by what I was told and what I observed. And the law of cause and effect is what rules the universe, and cause and effect is the same as true and false. And they do a good job of distracting us from acknowledging true and false. It's either correct or incorrect. And, everything is everything. They teach us that, and you learn that culture is not universal. But we are convinced that it is. I'm sounding like I'm rambling, but excellent program. It's a miracle I found this show, and I found it because something happened to me at work that just forced me to say, you know what, I'm not going to be confused anymore. I have to research what is this that I'm experiencing every day, because I'm the only black man in my office, and that was the last straw for me. I had to know I wasn't crazy, and this show helped me realize that I'm not crazy at all. It's hard being the only black man in the office, and in the commercial you play with Josh Wickett, and he says, "Do you smile when you're not happy? Agree when you really disagree? Laugh when nothing is funny?" That was me in my office every day for 10 years, and so excellent program, and I thank you for having it. Even on those days when you're a beat up victim and nothing seems to matter, it does matter. And for every person that calls in, there are 100 more who listen, and they go out and they wake themselves up too. So that's something I had to realize, because when I started spreading just a little bit of it, other people started making their own trek to find the truth. And so we're getting better exponentially, even though it seems like it's not worth it most of the time. Well, I'm done. Sorry to use up all 5 minutes.
Can I get that link, please, to that site for the books?
You mean the bookstore?
Yes, African, sir.
African World Books. That's AfricanWorldBooks.com. AfricanWorldBooks.com.
Hello?
Anybody else before we wrap up? Anybody else had anything they wanted to get in?
One more comment. How he was mentioning about being the only black in his office. Like I mentioned to my friend earlier, he's the only black person, at his bank. And I've been, giving more I've been tuning into the show, and I give him information, give him little books, and then he'd be reading at the office, looking up different websites. And he said he has a, white employee that kind of looks over his shoulder and then goes to her computer and types in the same site to kind of the reference of what he's been looking at and why he's so focused and been so, quiet and not as chipper as work as he used to be. And so I thought that was very, very interesting, because I'm sure a lot of black people are like that, when you're in the corporate.
Oh, and they do ask you, why you so quiet? Why you so serious?
Yes.
Why you so antisocial? They watch us closer than we think.
Oh my goodness! I mean, it's like they watch you. They watch your behavior, because you don't know it, but everything you do when you be in that office, they play you. They watch you. They like you. And then when you stop dancing to their tune, it's like, uh-oh. Like the Matrix when they flush you down the toilet when you wake up. But it's nothing like
think about
somebody.
they live where that white woman looks at her watch.
Like I said, it's nothing like when somebody comes back and you gave them some information, like CD of the Cows or whatever, and they come back and they like, whoa, like, man, you know, like you woke them up or something, man. That's a good feeling. And I meant to tell Gus, man, I had that a couple of times, and it's a good feeling, you know. I mean, it's a different message. Like, you know, when you think you deep and you talking nonsense, but you really think you know something, you spitting all this game. I'm dropping some knowledge and all this stuff. This is different, you know. It's like, where you gonna hear somebody tell you, you know, like you're vulnerable, you don't really like yourself, you don't like other black people, you know, no contact, blah blah blah. Man, nobody's talking about that, but that's the reality. So, you know, it's people, when they hear it, it's something totally different, and if they get it, they're really appreciative and thankful that you woke them up. I mean, just think, like, if somebody would have told you when you were 17, 16, 15, you know, just think if somebody would have just told you, like, look, think about how dumb you was and still are. You feel what I mean? It's like just not getting that information. So, I mean, each one teach one, I guess. You know, it's kind of cliche, but for real, man, I mean, they'd appreciate it. And I appreciate it, you know, you, Gus, and all you guys, really. So
I understand that. This makes me sane because, you know, I even tried to talk to my own mom about it, and she understands how it is. And when I talk to her, she feels so, you know, sympathetic because she can hear how I feel, but she doesn't really talk about it or address how it is and why people haven't actually tried to act against it. So it just, you know, that complacency is in a lot of black homes.
Thank you, everybody, for sharing. AfricanWorldBooks.com. AfricanWorldBooks.com. African with a K. Excellent resource. Dr. Chinweezu, I want to see if we can get him back on the program to talk about the Libya situation. I'm actually waiting because that's the person I most want to talk to about the Libya situation, because he had a very different perspective on things that have gone down and Mr. Gaddafi and all that. So I'm very interested to hear, you know, what he thinks about how things have transpired since he was on the program back in May. But I think he also has books that were very helpful. Marimba Ani, Dr. Marimba Ani, she referenced, that's how I found out about him in Urugu, but she referenced one of his books, The Rest and the West of Us. Excellent read, gives you a global perspective on white supremacy. And one of his other books, which I think is probably one of my favorites, Decolonizing the African Mind. Excellent read. Decolonizing Policy. Excellent reads, both of them. Excellent material. African Scholar really helps me get less confused about what's happening on the planet. I would say for all of those, really, if you're someplace where they have a really good college library, they'll probably have all of those. I know University of Washington, they had all of those work. White people study us. That's one thing I found. White people study us in detail. They have those books there for a reason, to refine their system. With that, I will wrap up. I'm going to play Gil Scott-Heron because I've been listening to a lot of Gil Scott-Heron of late. And he toast to the people, and he said toast to David Walker. And I mean, what can you say to that? Who does a song, a really good song, where they make a toast to David Walker? Man, Gil Scott, legend, Gil Scott-Heron. I'm going to close. I'm going to make sure I read one final passage from the book, just to emphasize, you know, why we should be serious. It's not about your 20-foot flat screen television or your iPod or any of the other foolishness. It should be about ending white terrorism as soon as possible. Before I do Justice's blog, justdojusticetoday.blogspot.com. justdojusticetoday.blogspot.com. Invest if you think the program is constructive. You can do that also by sharing links. That is super helpful. You can give out links to the program, put it on, you know, wherever you have a website, you can post to it. The media player that's on my blog, you can post that. Anything you can do to kind of help get the programs out so that more black people, more non-white people access the information, if you think it's constructive and would clear up some confusion, that is super helpful. This is page 134. I read some of this before, but I'm just adding some extra portions to round out the picture, and then I'll do the Gil Scott-Heron. This is page 134. On Monday night, Joe Crawford, a young black boy living with his parents in a racially mixed apartment building on Wentworth Avenue, heard a knock on the door. A white woman who lived in the building came to warn Crawford's mother that a gang of white teenagers was forming. An hour later, the gang appeared at the front door and rear doors of the tenement. "Niggers, come out and get your ass whipped, or stay in there and be barbecued," the leader shouted. The Crawfords, the parents plus 3 sons, squeezed out a tiny bathroom window onto the L tracks and crept through the darkness until a stranger, a black woman, brought them into their home to hide for the night. Another black couple, the Grinnells, spent Monday night and Tuesday morning cowering with their 18-month-old daughter on the apartment floor to avoid bullets being fired by cars of passing whites. Black journalist Roy Otley recounted the story of one anonymous victim, a black Army veteran who served 10 months overseas and was a clergyman's son. The man was heading home from a plant on the outskirts of the city when he stopped at an intersection to transfer to a streetcar bound for the south side. A group of 20 whites saw him. One yelled, "There's a nigger. Let's get him." He jumped onto a trolley, but the mob yanked down the pole from the power line. The motorman opened the rear door, and the black man took off, running as fast as he could. He ran for 3 blocks and threw away his jacket. Someone tried to trip him, but he jumped into the gutter and got away. He ran into a pharmacy for protection, but a white woman made him leave. He took off, running again. "My strength was fast failing," the black man recalled. "The idea came in my head to stop and give up or try to fight, but the odds were too great, so I kept running. My legs began to wobble, my breath came harder, and my heart was pounding like a big pump while they crept up on me." He outran the mob, but 2 whites fired guns at him. The man hid for several hours, and for the first time, it all sank in. "The injustice of the whole thing overwhelmed me, and my feelings ran riot," he said. "Had the 10 months I spent in France been all in vain? What had I done to deserve such treatment? I lay there trying to imagine how the innocent victim of a Southern mob must feel. Must a Negro always suffer because of his skin? There's a nigger. Let's get him." Those words kept ringing in my ears. He huddled in a dark alley and prayed to God to get home safely, then loaded his pockets with rocks for ammunition and headed home. When he saw Comiskey Park, where the White Sox played baseball, he knew he was safe. It had taken him 5.5 hours to get home. Later, he saw a white heading to work. "My first impulse was to jump on him and beat him up," he said. This is page 135, Red Summer, Cameron McWhirter. I'll just conclude before we hit the Gil Scott-Heron. Just, keep in mind for anybody who thinks that things have changed so drastically with the election of President Obama and these, white young white people running around, Occupy Wall Street and what have you. Just keep in mind the record ammunition sales that white people gathered in when President Obama, or he wasn't even president at the time, President-elect Obama was preparing to take the White House after he won the election in 2008. Just keep in mind record numbers of ammunition sales. I think even some of the ammo stores were running out. There was such a run on ammunitions and weapons by white people. I don't think they traded that in. They got that in response to a black male. And I think they'll be waiting to use their accumulated munitions on black people. Just keep that in mind. And if you need a visual reminder, that documentary we mentioned on the program Monday, Law and Disorder, you can watch it online. It'll give you a view, kind of give you a perspective on what I think easily could happen again today, 2012, what I think white people have in store for us on a mass scale. Law and Disorder. Frontline documentary. A.C. Thompson is in it. I think Dr. Leonard Moore is in it as well, to go into some of the details, just some of the details about what happened in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. The storm was the least of their worries. The problem then, tomorrow, yesterday, the problem, white people. Context of White Supremacy signing out. We will have a little Gil Scott here on before exiting. This is a toast to the people. Thank you for tuning in. Cal signing out after Gil Scott Heron.
We got to raise